Chapter 81. On the eve of the sorting, late that night, the first-year students huddled together in nervous whispers. Then, boom, boom, boom. 3 heavy knocks thundered through the corridor, and every voice fell silent. Ryan, who had been lost in thought, jolted upright as Hagrid's huge fist pounded on the door. At the sound, the door swung open almost of its own accord. Standing in the frame was a tall witch with sleek black hair and a stern expression, clad in an emerald green robe. Professor Minerva McGonagall, deputy headmistress and transfiguration professor, had arrived. After exchanging a few quiet words with Hagrid, Professor McGonagall drew her wand with a practiced flick and tapped the great oak door before her. It creaked wide to reveal a vast, torchlit hall. The flagstone floor stretched away beneath a ceiling so high it vanished into shadow. Along the far wall, a sweeping marble staircase wound upward, its polished rails gleaming in the flickering light. With a discreet nod from McGonagall, the first years fell into an orderly line. They crossed the hall in hushed awe and slipped into a smaller chamber at the opposite end, an empty room prepared for their final preparations before the sorting ceremony. Here, on the eve of their introduction to Hogwarts, the young witches and wizards waited with bated breath for what the morning would bring. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat and began. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she announced, her voice carrying through the great hall. She outlined the purpose of the sorting ceremony and introduced the 4 houses, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, emphasizing that each house would become its student's home away from home. Ryan stifled an eye roll. He'd endured nearly a decade of similarly grandiose speeches during his previous life's compulsory schooling. He'd grown all too familiar with the hollow pomp and circumstance. Beside him, Harry and the others plastered on polite smiles, their eyes betraying silent resignation. No doubt they'd come to appreciate the finer points only once points started slipping away. When Slytherin was mentioned, Ryan caught Ron scrunching his nose as if winking at some unspoken insult. McGonagall then explained Hogwarts' house point system. Exemplary behavior and accomplishments would earn points, while rule-breaking would incur deductions. At year's end, the house with the highest total would claim the coveted House Cup, a boundless source of pride for its members. As the minutes before the sorting ceremony slipped away, the first years grew increasingly restless. Ron's stomach gave a defiant growl, louder, he was convinced, than the sorting hat itself. Hermione and Draco Malfoy, by contrast, exchanged triumphant glances, as though they'd personally just secured the House Cup. From Ryan's perspective, however, all that swaggering was little more than an attempt to scare the new arrivals. After all, moral blackmail only works on those who care about points, and Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws hardly flinched at a few lost scores. Only Gryffindors and Slytherins ever let house standings determine their friendships. "In just a few minutes, we will begin the sorting ceremony," Professor McGonagall announced crisply. "Please straighten your robes and muster up as much enthusiasm as you can." She swept her gaze over Neville's cloak, its strap haphazardly knotted under his left ear, and noted the smudge of dirt on Ron's nose. Harry, meanwhile, tugged nervously at his unruly hair, trying in vain to smooth down the inevitable Potter chaos. McGonagall's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. She knew better than anyone that no shampoo in the world could tame the Potter's hereditary wildness. Only a steady stream of worthless galleons continued to pour into the Potter family vault. Professor McGonagall waved them off with a stern nod. "I'll come fetch you once it's ready," she instructed Ryan. "But until then, please keep quiet." No sooner had she hurried away than a low, eager buzz swept through the assembled first years. To Orion, it felt oddly familiar, even welcoming. Harry, by contrast, grew more frantic by the second. He turned to Ron, voice trembling. "How exactly does the sorting work?" Ron shrugged helplessly, just as lost as everyone else. Around them, nervous whispers rippled through the crowd. One girl was certain they'd have to pass a rigorous exam. A boy insisted they'd be tasked with slaying a dragon and snatching its eggs. Another swore the whole thing was a psychological evaluation in disguise. Hermione, ears closed to the gossip, buried her nose in a deck of flashcards and muttered spells under her breath. But rather than reassure Harry, her intense focus only drained the color from his cheeks. Ron, meanwhile, seemed utterly untroubled. He was hungrily eyeing an empty spot on the banquet tables, already dreaming of dinner. Harry's legs buckled, and Ryan opened her mouth to share the comforting truth she'd uncovered, when a sudden chorus of terrified screams tore through the hall. About 20 pearly white ghosts drifted out from behind the wall, whispering among themselves and utterly unaware of the first-year wizards trembling at their feet. Their hushed debate was about Peeves. Should they give him one more chance, or expel him from ghost class for good? A sudden voice cut through the murmurs. "What are you doing here?" A ghost in tight-fitting breeches and a ruffled Elizabethan collar hovered forward. It was Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, almost headless Nick, the celebrated resident ghost of Gryffindor Tower. The students froze. No one dared answer. Only Ryan, who was always a bit bolder than the rest, managed a hasty apology before scuttling off to join Penelope and Kate down the hall. Before Nick could say more, another figure emerged from the cluster, a round-faced, good-natured ghost garbed in the simple habit of a friar. This was the Fat Friar, Hogwarts' kindly Hufflepuff ghost. He offered the first years a warm smile. "Welcome, new student," he said gently. "You're here for the sorting, I take it? I do hope you'll end up in Hufflepuff. I was a proud member once myself." Even among spirits, his tone carried a touch of holy solemnity. The very air around him seemed to glow, an echo of the wizard who had almost become pope when he was alive. With that, the ghosts fell silent, their pale forms hovering like lanterns in the corridor. The Fat Friar's words hung in the air, a promise of friendship and the adventures to come at Hogwarts. At that moment, Professor McGonagall reappeared and quietly instructed the first years to fall into single file. The resident ghosts drifted off through the far wall and vanished. The little wizards filed through the foyer and pushed open the great double doors and stopped dead in awe. Before them lay the enchanted dining hall in all its splendor. 4 long tables stretched from end to end, each draped in one of Hogwarts' house colors, green, red, blue, and yellow. Countless candles floated above, their warm glow dancing across gleaming gold plates and goblets. At the far end, elevated on a dais, stood another long table set aside for the professors, its polished surface waiting for them to take their seats. Professor McGonagall led the new students forward and arranged them in a neat row at the foot of the staff table, facing every upperclassman. The professors themselves took their places behind her. Ryan's cheeks burned with embarrassment as he realized how silent the hall had become. Under the flickering candlelight, he lifted his gaze and saw hundreds of pale faces turned toward him, students with curious stares, and even a few ghosts drifting among them, their misty eyes aglow with a soft, silvery light. Harry couldn't believe his eyes. Seated on the dais behind him were Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful white wizard of modern times, and impossibly, Tom Riddle, the Dark Lord himself. Across the great hall, Kate at the Ravenclaw table caught his eye and gave him a sly wink. Nearby, Penello nudged Gil, who was staring hard at Harry, but neither dared speak up. To steady his acing heart, Harry let his gaze drift upward, taking in the velvety black ceiling scattered with glittering stars. It looked so much like the real night sky that he could almost feel a breeze on his face. Hermione, sitting at his side, noticed his fascination and leaned over to whisper, "They've enchanted the ceiling to mirror the sky outside. I read all about it in Hogwarts, a history of the school." Ron's eyes went wide with admiration. "Brilliant," he whispered back, forgetting for a moment that a professor was standing just behind them and that his twins were peering over the crowd on the opposite benches. Harry caught sight of Fred and George, mouths moving in animated gossip. Rather than use his uncanny hearing, he simply read their lips. That red-headed girl must be his brother's new girlfriend or something. Suppressing a smile, Harry settled back into his seat, determined to enjoy the feast, no matter how surreal the company. Percy, by contrast, frowned, his expression one of clear dissatisfaction. Chapter 82. Different Branches. At long last, the sorting began. Professor McGonagall stepped forward and placed the venerable sorting hat upon the 4-legged stool. Almost immediately, the hat's tall, pointed crown began to wriggle, and a wide slit, its mouth, opened at the brim. Then, in a quavering yet confident voice, it broke into song. "You might not think me pretty, but do not judge by what you see. If you find a finer hat than me, I'll eat it up, just you and me. Polish your bowler till it gleams, press your top hat into your dreams. I'm the magic hat of Hogwarts school. Naturally, I'm the best by rule. No hidden thought within your mind can from my golden gaze unwind. Just place me on your head to try, and I'll decide where you belong. Oh my. As the last note faded, the great hall fell silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the little stool. The moment had come to discover each student's true path at Hogwarts. The Sorting Hat cleared its throat and began to sing. You might be brave enough for Gryffindor, where courage dwells deep in your core. Bold hearts, daring souls, and gallant deeds are what make Gryffindor stand out indeed. Or perhaps you'll turn to Hufflepuff, where honest toil and loyal hearts are enough. Steadfast, patient, and true through every test. Unflinching, hard-working, giving all your best. Maybe you'll join the wise old Ravenclaw, where learning, wit, and knowledge are law. Sharp minds gather, ever eager to explore, in search of mysteries and truths galore. And then there's Slytherin, if you prefer ambition's path, where cunning plans occur. Resourceful, determined, willing to achieve, by any means, your goals you'll surely seize. So come, wear me. Don't be afraid. Though I have no hands, your fate is safely laid, for I'm a thinking magic hat, you see, and I'll sort you into the house you're meant to be. With a flourish of its brim, the hat bowed to the gathered students as if it had just delivered a star-turn performance. A ripple of applause swept through the hall. Beside him, Ron gave Harry an encouraging grin and teased, "See, all we have to do is plop this ridiculous hat on our heads." He gave Harry a reassuring nudge. "Piece of cake, right?" "I want to kill Fred," Harry muttered under his breath. His line sounded like he was gearing up to fight a giant. The moment Fred's bravado hung in the air, Harry's shoulders finally relaxed. Hermione fell silent, her lips no longer moving in a nervous chant, and Neville's usual timid expression seemed to brighten with newfound confidence. Professor McGonagall stepped forward, holding a long scroll of parchment. "When I call your name," she said crisply, "come forward. Place the Sorting Hat on your head, sit on the stool, and wait for your house to be announced." She peered down at the parchment and called out the first name. "Hannah Abbott!" A girl with two long, golden braids stepped out of the line and slipped the hat over her eyes. There was a pause, and then in a quavering voice the hat boomed, "Hufflepuff!" The Hufflepuffs at the end of the table cheered, and the fat friar waved, welcoming her warmly. Next came Susan Bones, another Hufflepuff, to the delight of her neighbors. One by one, the new arrivals were sorted in alphabetical order by last name. As the list worked its way through the A's and B's, then the C's and D's, houses filled up with puffing, tasting, crowing, or cheering, depending on the hat's decision. Poor Ryan Matthews, whose surname begins with M, found himself nearly at the end of the line, stuck behind Harry Potter himself, whose P landed him in Gryffindor. In the original books, Blaise Zabini was famously the very last to be called, but here Ryan's name came just before the Z's, and his fate was soon revealed beneath the ancient talking hat. And so the first years settled into their new houses, some with jubilant applause, others with tentative smiles. Hogwarts would never feel quite the same for any of them again. I stand on the stay, every pair of eyes trained on me. It's a little unnerving. I can practically feel their stares. Still, there's something else that eases my nerves. The knowledge that this version of events may yet stray from the story we all know. Take Hermione Granger, for example. I'd already spotted her sneaking looks at Ron's newest reading material. When she climbed into the carriage earlier, her eyes lit up at the sight of a well-worn copy of Doraemon tucked beside Ron's schoolbooks, a gesture only a true book lover could manage. Of course, Hermione would have noticed the latest phenomenon. In this universe, after all, she's long supplemented her textbooks with everything from ancient runes to graphic novels. Why should she overlook the little blue robot cat who's captured so many imaginations? Flipping through its pages, she bursts into laughter at Nobita's latest mishap, proof, if any were needed, that great ideas often come from the most unexpected places. Meanwhile, her face flashes with admiration when the story recounts how Vader, yes, that Darth Vader, or Fat Tiger, as Nobita's pals mockingly call him, displays a courage not unlike a Gryffindor's. Then there's Luke Skywalker, or Luke K. Skywalker, whose mistreatment on the dark alley's edge stands as a cautionary tale for anyone who slacks off on their studies. Just then, the Sorting Hat, perched atop Hermione's head, cracks a grin at her enthusiastic page-flipping. "Hermione Granger!" it calls out in its familiar creaky voice. "Ravenclaw!" she replies instantly, her eyes still sparkling with curiosity and zeal. In that moment, it's clear, even on a stage under 1,000 gazes, a true reader always finds a story to call their own. Ryan settled into the line of first years awaiting the Sorting Hat and glanced down the row. Ron Weasley, further back, his name began with W, wore an anxious mask, his knuckles white as he gripped his robe. With plenty of time before Ron's turn, Ryan focused on the ceremony. When Neville Longbottom shuffled forward and sat on the small stool, the Sorting Hat seemed to deliberate forever. Then, in a clear voice that echoed through the great hall, it declared, "Neville Longbottom, Ravenclaw." A ripple of astonishment ran around the room. Neville? In Ravenclaw? Ryan recalled how, in the original tale, Neville's quiet courage and his friendship with Hermione Granger had sent him to Gryffindor. Was it possible that the Hat had once overlooked some hidden ambition or thirst for wisdom? The thought intrigued him, but the sorting had to continue. One by one, the remaining first years were called: Draco Malfoy, Marcus Flint, Theodore Nott, Pansy Parkinson, the Paddle twins Parvati and Padma, each greeted with applause or groans. Next came Sally Ann Perks. Finally, Professor McGonagall scanned her parchment and announced, "Harry James Potter." A wave of whispers and gasps rolled through the hall. "That's Harry Potter, the boy who lived. He's right beside Weasley. When did he arrive?" Across the hall in the Slytherin ranks, Draco Malfoy, now reunited with Crabbe and Goyle, turned his full attention to Harry. He fixed Potter with a delighted, predatory stare, as if he'd unearthed a priceless treasure, and completely ignored his cronies. On the raised platform, Ron finally heard his name, hopped onto the stool, and caught Malfoy's gaze. Without hesitation, he shot the blonde Slytherin a fiery glare, determined to stand his ground. With the surprise of Neville's new house and Harry's dramatic entrance still buzzing in every mind, the great hall fell silent once more. The sorting ceremony would continue, but its biggest revelations were already made. Harry mounted the stool at the head of the great hall, its long tables crowded with curious faces, all craning to catch a glimpse of him. The torchlight danced off the enchanted ceiling, but Harry barely registered it. His attention was fixed on the moment to come. Then the hall dissolved into darkness, and a small, urgent voice whispered in his ear. "Well now," it said, "this is tricky. Very tricky. You, brave, you're kind-hearted, you've got talent. Oh my, you even thirst to prove yourself. That's most intriguing. But where should I put you?" Harry's fingers dug into the edge of the stool as he thought. Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin. Deep in his mind, without Harry noticing, the faces of his most dreaded childhood cats, Kick, Chair, Mr. Claw, and Mau Mau, twisted into view. Then a mischief-making Jerry, conjured by Ryan, appeared, only to shift into a sleek black lion. Each feline specter seemed to embody the very traits that would bar him from Gryffindor. From the raised platform, Ryan stood with the sorting hat in hand. For the first time in ages, he allowed himself a genuine smile as he peered down at Harry. "Not Slytherin, eh?" the hat teased. "Have you made up your mind? You can do great things, you know, and Slytherin could help you achieve glory without question. Not interested? Well, if you're certain, then you'd better head over to Ravenclaw." The Sorting Hat's final declaration rang out across the great hall. Harry slid it off, and his legs trembling, made his way to the Ravenclaw table. Relief washed over him. He hadn't been placed in Slytherin. "No, Harry," Ron cried out, but nobody paid him any mind. Snape's eyes widened in astonishment. Professor Flitwick leapt to his feet, cheering. Quirrell's jaw practically hit the floor. From the far left of the hall, the Gryffindors erupted in triumphant shouts, while the Ravenclaws at the second table joined in, some even booing the Gryffindors in playful rivalry. "Quiet! The sorting continues," Dumbledore called, his composure unshaken. Ron scowled. He'd been looking forward to more excitement, but the ceremony pressed on just the same. Chapter 83, An Unexpected Discovery. Only 5 students remained, waiting to learn their assignments: Ryan Smith, Lisa Turpin, Dean Thomas, Ron Weasley, and Blaise Zabini. Ryan felt a flicker of disappointment. He'd half hoped that Zacharias Smith, the insufferable chatterbox, would be here too, but of course, Smith was a common name in the wizarding world. There was no relation between him and the Hufflepuff, who'd once pestered the Weasley twins so relentlessly that they'd threatened him with the entire inventory of Zonko's joke shop. Like Hepzibah Smith, the unfortunate Hufflepuff heiress whose gold cup and Slytherin locket had fallen into Voldemort's hands, Zacharias Smith had joined Dumbledore's army. But it wasn't out of any noble desire to stand against the Dark Lord. He'd merely wanted to indulge his curiosity about the rumors of Voldemort's return. He hadn't even been invited to the original meeting at the Hog's Head. He'd simply lurked outside, overheard Hermione inviting Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott, and bullied his way into the secret. Ryan shook his head, trying to let go of his irritation. After all, this wasn't about Zacharias Smith. This was their moment. He straightened his robes and looked around at his companions, determined not to let petty frustrations spoil whatever lay ahead. Ryan smirked as he strode forward across the Great Hall. He still couldn't believe how hard he'd pressed Ginny Weasley for every detail of Harry Potter's daring ministry break-in, only to end up on the receiving end of her pure totem locomotor jinx. Charming. Maybe having the last name Smith wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And now this. As he stepped into the circle of candlelight, dozens of heads snapped around. I know him. He's the one who... Mom, I'm in love again. Can you stop rolling your eyes? Smith, pureblood or mudblood, whatever, he's mine. A wave of excited and perfectly rude stares washed over him, as though they expected him to perform on the spot. Ryan's jaw tightened. He swallowed the urge to snap back and kept walking until he reached the low stool at the center of the hall. The moment he sat, the sorting hat, a battered crimson and gold relic, was eased over his eyes. Darkness fell, and the clamor of the room dimmed to a distant roar. Perfect. Now it would be just him and whatever ancient magic lived in that hat. He'd heard rumors it once belonged to a legendary Gryffindor swordsman. Blindfolded, unstoppable, said to strike down foes with nothing but his mental focus. Ryan snorted silently, a hat that Lofty could hardly govern a boy's college house. It was only reading his character, not rummaging through memories. Bold, you say? A thirst for knowledge, a sharp mind. The hat's voice was slow, teasing. Ryan held his breath. Would it put him with the daring lion, the brave badgers, the cunning snakes, or the scholarly eagles? A heartbeat passed. Then the hat spoke again, louder this time. Ravenclaw! Applause and cheers exploded around him. Ryan peeled off the hat and stood, blinking at the sea of blue and bronze robes. Ravenclaw. Somehow, it felt right. With a small, satisfied grin, he strode down the bench to join his new housemates, ready for whatever came next. Ryan barely registered what was happening. He'd barely rested the sorting hat on his head before it shouted, Ravenclaw, leaving him stunned. He'd come to Hogwarts prepped like a battle-hardened monster slayer, not expecting to be swept up in a plot that seemed to ignore combat prowess entirely. But perhaps it was the sequence of students already sorted, or maybe his own unexpected charisma. The Ravenclaw table exploded with applause louder than anything so far. Prefects leaned forward in excitement, Penelope among them, while Ryan, feeling slightly out of place, found himself ushered to a seat beside Hermione. Directly across the long hall, Harry watched with an intrigued smile. No sooner had Ryan sat down than Lisa Dupin was called next. Like him, she was sent to Ravenclaw, earning another round of cheers. Then came Dean. Just as in the original tale, he was sorted into Gryffindor. Finally, it was Ron's turn. The sorting hat deliberated over his head nearly as long as it had for Neville Longbottom, murmuring about courage and loyalty. At last it pronounced, "Better be, Ravenclaw." A collective gasp rose from the hall. Ron, cheeks burning, trotted down the bench and flopped into the seat beside Harry, slumping against the backrest in disbelief. Fred and George Weasley exchanged triumphant grins, while Percy, his prefect badge gleaming on his chest, strode forward and joined them at the Ravenclaw table, his expression one of proud satisfaction. And just like that, the first-year sorting ceremony had turned into a Ravenclaw takeover. Percy Weasley let out a theatrical cheer as he strode past Harry and Ron. Well done, Ron. Fantastic job. Soon it was time for the last student. Professor McGonagall peered at the parchment in her hand. Blaise Zabini, she announced, placing the parchment aside. Slytherin. the Sorting Hat confirmed. With that, she lifted the hat from Harry's head one final time and made her way back to the staff table. The 4 long house tables stood before them, their gleaming golden plates still empty. A low rumble of stomachs filled the hall. Harry and Ron looked as though they hadn't eaten since boarding the Hogwarts Express. Albus Dumbledore rose from his chair at the high table, his twinkling eyes roaming over the assembled students. He spread his arms wide, as if he could embrace the entire hall in one go. A broad smile lit up his face. "Welcome," he boomed, his voice echoing against the enchanted ceiling. "Welcome, one and all, to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry for the start of a brand new term. Before we tuck into tonight's feast, I have just a few words to share. They are, in my humble opinion, idiot, crybaby, scum, twist. Thank you all." He sat down again, and the hall erupted in applause and cheers. Harry watched the spellbound faces around him, and then noticed Ryan Smith, a fellow student from the wizarding world Harry had only just begun to know. Ryan's jaw was hanging open, his eyes wide in shock at Dumbledore's unexpected parting lines. Harry leaned over, giving Ryan's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Ryan, do you feel the same way I do?" he whispered. "A little crazy?" Ryan didn't answer. He stared past Harry, lost in his own thoughts. Across the table, Percy, Ron's red-haired brother, still lingering at the Ravenclaw end, leaned in, his voice low but eager. "Crazy? He's a genius, the finest wizard alive. But you're right, he is a bit eccentric. Harry, want more potatoes?" Harry blinked and looked down at his plate, now piled high with roast potatoes, buttery peas, and juicy slices of meat. Perfect. In Ryan's mind, Dumbledore, who moments ago had sounded to Harry like he was rambling, shone like a blazing sun. No, 2 suns. Beyond the formidable magic he wielded, tinged with an almost feral intensity, there lay another power. Majestic, solemn, and utterly unmistakable. Anyone who knew Dumbledore's secrets would instantly recognize its source. And Ryan did. As he sat there, the strands of memory and magic wove together, pulling him back to that fateful summer in Godric's Hollow. He and Dumbledore had sealed a blood pact, vowing never to harm one another. Then calamity had struck, shattering their promise and driving them apart for years. Now seated at this noisy banquet, those old bonds and buried loyalties stirred once more in Ryan's mind. From across the ocean, in the United States, Albus Dumbledore and Gellert Grindelwald continued their rivalry by proxy, using Newt Scamander as an unwitting pawn in a clandestine game of secrets. Every letter, every coded message that passed through Newt's hands rekindled in both men the promise and peril of their long-lost bond. It was the spring of 1945, just before the final storm of war broke, when Dumbledore and Grindelwald agreed to meet in absolute privacy. There, away from the eyes of friend and foe alike, they invoked the terms of their ancient blood pact, an enchantment more intimate than any marriage vow. In that secluded chamber, each man became a living prison for the other, their magic interlocked so completely that defeat carried a fate worse than any cell. The victor would be granted a single, inescapable wish. The vanquished would forfeit his freedom entirely, doomed thereafter to perceive the world only through his adversary's eyes. When the Aurors finally seized Grindelwald and secured him in Ermengarde, it was not mere punishment that kept him there. Bound by blood and will, he remained tethered to Dumbledore's essence, sharing in every triumph and sorrow the great wizard experienced beyond the prison walls. It was memories of one golden summer, days of sunlit laughter and whispered confidences, that sustained Grindelwald through decades of solitary confinement. Yet the 2 men's desires had grown irreconcilable. Dumbledore's sole purpose was to end Grindelwald's reign of terror and halt the atrocities his vision had unleashed. Grindelwald, by contrast, was driven by equal parts ambition and a desperate hope, to reverse his defeat, to reclaim the love he believed once flared between them. Even in captivity, their duel of ideals and emotions waged on, each bound to the other by a bond as unbreakable as the blood that sealed their fates. Chapter 84. Nick almost lost his head. The great hall of Hogwarts buzzed with conversation and clattering dinnerware. 3 wizards, each bound to another in strange ways, sat among the students. Harry Potter, who harbored a piece of Voldemort's soul, Voldemort himself, once lodged in Professor Quirrell, and Albus Dumbledore, who still carried the mark of Gellert Grindelwald in his past. Ryan's thoughts drifted among these unlikely connections, until Percy Weasley's voice cut through his reverie with a fresh insult aimed at Dumbledore. "Isn't it obvious?" Ryan said, leaning toward Harry and Hermione. "Each house has its slur for the others." He counted them off on his fingers. "Stupid is Ravenclaw, because they think everyone else is an idiot. Crybaby is Gryffindor. They see outsiders as cowards. Trash is Slytherin. They call non-Slytherins impure, worthless scraps. And weird, that's Hufflepuff's specialty. They think everyone else is twisted." Harry, spoon in midair, paused. The tantalizing spread before him, roast beef, roast chicken, pork chops, lamb chops, sausages, and steaks, not to mention potatoes prepared every possible way, Yorkshire puddings, peas, carrots, gravies, even mint candies, suddenly lost its appeal. Percy's ears turned scarlet. Without another word, he slunk back to the Gryffindor table, head down, clearly embarrassed. Silence rippled through the table as everyone absorbed Ryan's breakdown of house rivalries. The real battle, it seemed, was sometimes fought in nicknames rather than on the Quidditch pitch. Ron tugged at his ears and shot Harry an embarrassed look. He was beginning to suspect that flushed redness might be a Weasley family trait, right alongside their trademark hair. Harry caught the awkward tension, but pretended not to notice. He was hungry, after all, so he followed Ron's lead. He piled a little of everything onto his plate and began to eat contentedly. By the time they reached the second half of the feast, Hogwarts' resident ghosts drifted into the Great Hall. At the Gryffindor table floated nearly headless Nick, his ruffled collar bobbing in midair. Across the way at Ravenclaw's table glided the Grey Lady, so named for her shimmering silver robes and hair that fell past her waist like moonlight. She looked every inch the otherworldly princess of some celestial palace, yet her cold, withdrawn bearing kept all curious students at a respectful distance. Nearly headless Nick, by contrast, seemed almost wistful. He hovered above the table, watching the plates piled high with roast pudding and sweet treacle tart. Harry, who was about halfway through his meal, noticed the melancholy look on Nick's translucent face. "Fancy a bite?" Harry called up, offering the ghost a friendly grin. Nick sighed, a noble tilt to his head that sent a few strands of jet-black hair drifting. "I haven't actually eaten for 400 years, he replied. "I don't need food, my spectral form sustains me, but I must admit, I do miss the taste." Harry shrugged. "Well, I'm happy to snack on your behalf." He took another forkful of roast beef and winked at his ghostly friend. Nick's sorrowful expression lifted a fraction, and for a moment, the cold hall felt a little warmer. Chapter 7. Nearly headless and wide-eyed. "I don't believe I've formally introduced myself," the ghost announced, drifting forward as the candles on the long tables flickered in his translucent glow. "Sir Nicholas of Mimsy Porpington, resident ghost of Gryffindor Tower." "Nearly headless Nick," Ron supplied loudly from the Gryffindor table, not bothering with ceremony. He tipped back his goblet of pumpkin juice and smirked. Sir Nicholas's face flickered with embarrassment. "If you please," the ghost corrected, "Sir Nicholas." Before anyone could respond, the boy with light brown hair, standing just ahead of Harry and me, in line to enter the Great Hall, spun around. "Nearly headless?" he exclaimed. "How do you almost get your head chopped off?" That was Seamus Finnegan, whose proclivity for explosive arms had earned him the nickname the Human Explosion among the first years. Even now, the memory of his last, rather loud mistake at Charms class was fresh in everyone's minds. Hermione leaned toward me, wide-eyed. "Ryan, did you hear that? He's going to show us!" I grabbed Hermione's arm and hissed, "Close your eyes, right now. Harry, you too!" Harry's green eyes shot wide in alarm, making Professor Snape, perched at the teacher's table, freeze mid-chew of what looked like a sausage, his fork poised in midair. Snape's expression was part delight, part fury. Hermione blinked, registered what I was saying, then shut her eyes so hard her eyelashes fluttered. Harry obeyed immediately, squinting shut and leaning slightly away. Even Seamus, torn between curiosity and dread, shut his eyes. Snape, of course, refused. A hush fell over the hall. Sir Nicholas cleared his throat. With a dramatic flourish of his limp cloak, he unfastened his head at the neck, letting it dangle by a single silver sinew. A collective gasp swept the students. Hermione pressed a hand to her lips. Harry's knees buckled, and he nearly slid off his bench. Seamus let out a tiny yelp. Professor Snape's fork clattered to the table as he leaned forward, eyes locked on the dangling head. After a suspenseful moment, Sir Nicholas reattached his head with a discreet flick of magic. He cleared his throat again and said, "Thank you for indulging me. I hope you'll find my unique condition educational." Then he glided off into the shadows beside the high table. Hermione cautiously opened her eyes. When she saw me sitting next to her, her cheeks flushed a rosy pink. She'd never noticed me before, at least not properly, but now her gaze lingered. I shrugged with an apologetic grin. "Sorry, but you did ask how someone can be almost headless." She laughed softly, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. It was worth it. Harry nudged me, still grinning at the memory. Seamus, eyes still wide, wiped his hands on his robes and sank low on his bench. Professor Snape shot me a warning look that might have frozen molten iron. I just smirked back, confident that this year at Hogwarts was going to be unforgettable. "Like this," Nick snapped, clearly impatient and more than a little annoyed. With exaggerated drama, he grasped the side of his neck, tugged down his head, and let it swing to rest on his shoulder, exposing the gruesome cross-section where neck met skull. A chorus of gasps and retches rippled through the crowd. A few stunned onlookers leaned away in horror, while some of the Gryffindor first-years, positioned farther back, mistook the display for a thrilling spectacle and cheered wildly. Pleased by the uproar, Nick released his head. The unbroken strip of flesh along one side, acting like a perfect hinge, snapped his head neatly back into place. He turned to face the freshman with a satisfied grin. "As a ghost of Gryffindor," he announced, "I demand that you work twice as hard now that Slytherin has claimed the House Cup 6 years running." He then pointed an accusing finger at the Bloody Baron, who hovered nearby, translucent and brooding. "And don't think I've forgotten you, Baron. You and your Slytherin tricks." From the edge of the crowd, Ryan leaned over to a friend. "Why doesn't Nick just complain to Snape? Slytherin's 6-year streak has everything to do with Snape's favoritism." His friend shivered. "The Baron's temper is bad enough," he whispered back. "You don't want to see what happens if you really provoke him." Rowena Ravenclaw once sent her servant, the Baron, to retrieve her estranged daughter, Helena. Helena, however, had already claimed the lost diadem and refused to surrender it. In that moment of defiance, the Baron leapt forward and drove a knife through her heart. Overcome by grief and guilt, he plunged the same blade into himself. From that day on, Helena's spirit roamed Hogwarts as Lady Grey, Ravenclaw's ghost. The Baron, too, remained bound to the castle, but his was a darker fate. Known thereafter as the Bloody Baron, he drifted through the corridors, his eyes glassy with remorse, his once fine robes forever marred by a faint, silvery stain of Helena's blood. When Professor Ryan first heard the tale, he found it oddly discordant. As a skilled wizard, why had the Baron resorted to a simple knife instead of using his wand? Why had Helena fallen so swiftly? Perhaps trusting too completely in her dog's loyalty, she never expected her own guardian to turn violent. Ryan even wondered if the Baron had been tempted by Gryffindor's fiery spirit, for the use of cold steel runs against Slytherin's usual style. Yet there he was, knife in hand. It struck him, too, that the Bloody Baron taught this brutal method to his one pupil, a tradition of edged weapons passed from master to apprentice. Now, as Ryan gazed upon the Baron's ghostly form, he noticed heavy shackles binding his spectral wrists and ankles, as if the castle itself kept him prisoner in eternal penance. And still, the tiny flecks of silver-tinged blood clinging to his robes glimmered in the torchlight, an unbreakable reminder of a daughter's life stolen and a servant's unending remorse. Ryan frowned as he watched Baron's translucent form drift at Draco's side. How had the fallen wizard, who'd once carried nothing but a wand and a dagger when he died, come to wear those ethereal shackles? And what tormented him so that he now hovered in this half-life, bound to atone for some unspoken sin? Before Ryan could puzzle it out, Draco's famously proud alabaster face contorted in pain. It was as if every ounce of composure had been ripped away, revealing a raw anguish no human ought to bear. Ryan's finger itched to raise his enchanted recorder and capture the moment. Such a look belonged in legends, not before the eyes of the living. Beside him, Harry's eyes sparkled with delight. He swept his forkful of steak into his mouth, cheered on by the spectacle of Draco's misery. In his glee, Harry elbowed Ron so hard that Ron, clutching 2 chicken drumsticks, began to choke. White-knuckled, Ron staggered, his dinner turning to panic. Ryan lunged forward and steadied Ron's arm, knocking the chicken free just in time. Ron gasped, coughing, as the rest of the table erupted in a mixture of laughter and relieved sighs. Above them, Baron's ghost flickered uneasily, the clinking of his shackles echoing the weight of his lingering regret. The question of how and why he'd become their eternal penitent would have to wait. For now, they had dinner to finish and a stunned Draco to watch. Chapter 85, Hermione's Secret. Lion hadn't even broken a sweat when she pulled Ron to safety. He scrambled to his feet, breathless, mumbling his thanks while Harry shot Lion an awkward, embarrassed look. Nearby, Seamus was badgering nearly headless Nick for answers. "Why is the Bloody Baron always covered in blood?" he demanded. Nick straightened his ruff, eyes distant and unhelpful. "I'm afraid I don't know," he replied stiffly. "Never asked, never cared to." Harry and Ron exchanged disappointed glances, and even Hermione, who'd been listening from the sidelines, frowned. Not far from them, the Grey Lady drifted silently away from the Great Hall. Her ghostly form was as pale and remote as ever, her expression one of regal disdain. Ryan watched her go and let out a long, low sigh. "You know," he murmured to Leon, "even a 1,000-year-old spirit like her couldn't resist Tom Riddle back when he was a student. He was that good at charming secrets out of people." Leon raised an eyebrow. Ryan continued, "All it took was his handsome face and that 7-inch tongue of his. He charmed the Grey Lady into revealing the very secret she'd guarded until her death." He paused, amused. "When she told it, she stammered like a love-struck teenager. I don't know. He was so considerate, so sympathetic." Leon cast a glance at the Bloody Baron, whose spectral form still bore the tinge of old wounds. She noticed a faint greenish sheen to his hair and shook her head. Ryan was right. Voldemort's truest power lay not in dark magic, but in the irresistible spell of his own charisma. If he hadn't abandoned those abilities, Voldemort could still be the kind of wizard who makes himself irresistibly charming at will, perhaps even rising to become Minister of Magic. Instead, he ended up a disembodied spirit, his mind unmoored. As the compartment filled, Hermione leaned toward Ryan, whether deliberately or simply by chance, and steered the conversation straight to Transfiguration. In that moment, a glimmer of insight sparked in Ryan's mind. In his mental memory palace, the pages of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire turned as if caught by an unseen breeze. He found himself revisiting the very chapter. She didn't do anything. She just shouldn't have been there at that moment. Hermione shot back at Percy, leaving him genuinely taken aback. Despite their occasional squabbles, Hermione and Percy had always enjoyed a good rapport, arguably even better than they had with anyone else. Actually, better than with anyone else? All the young witches at Hogwarts seemed to be hopeless romantics. Just look at Ginny Weasley. She was smitten with Harry the moment she met him, and her infatuation in first year was so intense that Voldemort almost exploited her feelings to gain an advantage. That made me wonder, could Hermione Granger have harbored a secret crush on Percy Weasley from day one? Think about it. Hermione, untouched by Ron's laid-back charm or Harry's fame, has always been the meticulous rule-follower who reveres authority and lives for her studies. Percy embodies every trait she admires: disciplined, ambitious, and utterly devoted to the ministry. Even his owl's name, Hermes, is a clever masculine echo of Hermione. And when Hermione was captured in the 7th year, the very first person she worried about wasn't Harry or Ron, but Penelope Clearwater, Percy's fiancée. That kind of loyalty speaks volumes. If Percy really had a type, might that be why he gravitated towards someone like Hermione? And what about Ron? Their relationship has always felt more like close friends than star-crossed lovers. No secret yearnings, just genuine camaraderie. It just proves that keeping mundane emotions under wraps, saving your mental energy for what really matters, is the wiser play, Ryan observed, leaning back with a grin. Trust me, life gets a lot more interesting that way. Ryan's hand brushed against Hermione's as he leaned in quietly. Transfiguration's all about precision, he murmured. Start small. Try turning a matchstick into a needle before moving O-N to anything bigger. Hermione's eyes lit up, but before she could respond, a fresh wave of clattering dishes heralded the arrival of dessert. and Ron, ever ravenous, immediately dived back into his plate, barely pausing for air. In a matter of seconds, the main course vanished, leaving the plates, forks, and knives gleaming. Then came the real treat. Bowls of creamy ice cream in every flavor imaginable, apple pie hot from the oven, golden treacle tart, fluffy chocolate sponge cake, freshly fried jam donuts, sticky toffee pudding drizzled with rich caramel, bowls of glistening strawberries, wobbly fruit jelly, and even comforting rice pudding sprinkled with cinnamon. As they tucked in, conversation turned to family. Seamus, with a mischievous grin, recounted the day his muggle father discovered his wife was a witch. "He nearly choked on his tea," Seamus laughed, and the table erupted with giggles and sympathetic oohs. Hermione, spoon poised in midair, took the opportunity to turn back to Ryan. "Tell me again, what's the key to Wingardium Leviosa?" Ryan sighed good-naturedly. Hermione had already practiced the basic incantation countless times back home, but here, among peers, she wanted to prove herself. He guided her through the proper wand movement and the subtle flick of the wrist, offering careful corrections as Hermione's eyes shone with determination. By the time the last crumb was gone and the plates were cleared, the first sparks of magic, and a growing friendship, had firmly taken root. Ron erupted into laughter and punctuated it with a theatrical belch before turning his attention back to Neville with a fresh round of teasing. He barely registered the soft-spoken exchange unfolding between Ryan and Hermione. The professor's droning lecture on transfiguration and levitation was the perfect lullaby. A few desks away, Anthony Goldstein, his dark hair gleaming, held court among his friends. "You know Newt Scamander, right?" he announced. "He got sorted into the wrong house. Honestly, if he'd gone to Ravenclaw, they never would have expelled him. Ravenclaw's the one house that welcomes misfits. Just ask Luna Lovegood, who's been teased more times than she can count." Terry Boot and Michael Corner both nodded. "Goldstein, huh?" Terry mused. "Could be. Newt's partner is Tina Goldstein, an American witch. Maybe Anthony's a distant cousin." Back in their old world, the three of them were inseparable, Michael added. They always shared the same interests. Ryan listened from his seat, letting the gossip swirl in his mind. Terry, with his warm brown skin, and Michael, whose complexion was equally rich, were both clearly from the States, and quietly rumored to be gay. If Newt himself was also queer, Ryan thought with a half-smile, their little circle would be perfectly and flamboyantly complete. Neville shrugged and told them how he'd been raised by his grandmother, and, long before he even knew the word squib, people mistook him for one. They'd gone so far as to try and wake his magic by nearly killing him on more than one occasion. Surprisingly, the younger students merely nodded, as if having near-death experiences were Sunday dinner conversation. Across the row, Ryan was still hashing out homework problems with Hermione when he felt a sudden chill at the back of his neck. "Uh-oh, Penelope," he whispered, feigning exhaustion as he smoothly wrapped up his discussion. When he turned, Penelope's face was as cold and hard as stone, her eyes fixed on him in silent accusation. Beside her, Kate's lips curled into a triumphant smirk as she took dainty bites of her pudding. "Fantastic! No chance of sleep for me tonight," Ryan muttered under his breath, emotionless but inwardly wincing at his predicament. Not even the memory of Harry's first, unforgettable confrontation with Voldemort and the look on Snape's face that followed was as intense as the glare Penelope was shooting his way. Harry stifled a gasp and pressed a hand to his forehead. Ron, however, was completely oblivious. From the next table over, Percy leaned in, concern etched across his features. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Sure enough, if Percy chose to side with them, Ron and Hermione wouldn't stand a chance. If he altered his loyalties and shared their experiences, he might even sway Harry. Harry's eyes flicked to the greasy-haired professor with the hooked nose and sallow skin seated next to Snape, Professor Quirrell, and he nudged Percy. "What do you make of him?" he asked quietly. He'd never suspected that the pain pulsing through his scar could be the work of the man beside Snape. At last, with the final spoonful of pudding gone, the dinner drew to a close. Chapter 86. Prohibited Items. The great hall buzzed with quiet chatter and the occasional belch as students finished their feasts. At the head table, Professor Dumbledore rose and swept a kindly gaze over the assembled crowd. Bit by bit, the murmurs died away. Now that you've all eaten and drunk your fill, he began, I have a few announcements to make as we embark on a new term. He paused to let the silence settle. First-year students, the Forbidden Forest remains strictly off-limits. I trust our returning students can confirm the wisdom of that rule, he added with a pointed look at Fred and George Weasley. Secondly, Mr. Filch has asked me to remind you that the list of banned items in the castle has grown this year. Among the new additions are bamboo dragonflies, hobby horses, and water snorkels. In fact, there are over 400 items now prescribed in total. If you're curious to see the full list, feel free to inspect the notice board outside Filch's office. A ripple of protest swept the tables. What's so dangerous about bamboo dragonflies? Called a voice from the Gryffindor table. Our first year's not allowed to bring their own broomsticks either. A second voice, this one sharp and self-satisfied, piped up from the Slytherin side. I'm in second year, and I didn't even know we could fly those things yet. As whispers spread through the hall, Dumbledore smiled indulgently and raised a hand. Rest assured, the rules are there for your own safety, and for reasons you'll discover soon enough. Now, let us proceed with the rest of the evening's program. With that, the headmaster sat, and the hall fell into a more orderly hush, anticipation humming in the air. We're allowed to carry broomsticks, but not bamboo dragonflies, which barely fly faster than a snail. What's going on at this school? Does Hogwarts forbid bamboo dragonflies underwater? It must be a Slytherin plot. They want the whole lake to themselves. What did Maju ever do wrong? Around the notice board, students clamored in outrage. Someone had posted 3 new bulletins. 1. A formal explanation regarding the ban on bamboo dragonflies will be posted outside Mr. Filch's office by day's end. 2. Quidditch tryouts for the college team will be held in the second week of term. Interested students should contact Madam Hu Chi. 3. Warning. Anyone wishing to avoid accident, or worse, must not enter the corridor at the far right end of the 4th floor. The last warning barely registered. Instead, the majority of students denounced Filch's edict and hastily drafted a joint petition to Dumbledore, demanding he lift the ban. At the Gryffindor table, Harry and Ron listened to the furor without much interest. Dumbledore, however, surveyed the hall with twinkling eyes. He set aside his morning tea and excused himself from Percy's chattering company to approach Ron's bench. With a gentle smile, he asked, Ronald, I've been following this debate about a certain bamboo dragonfly and an underwater breathing tube. Do you think you could explain what they are and where they originate? I must confess they're new to me. Harry looked up at last, curiosity finally piqued. As Ron began to describe the curious devices, the murmurs around the hall quieted. Today's lesson, it seemed, would not be found in any textbook. Professor Dumbledore rose from behind the high table and clapped his hands. Before everyone turns in for the night, let's sing the school song together. His voice rang so cheerfully that the other teachers on the dais and the prefects, everyone except the Weasley twins, froze in place, their smiles vanishing for a moment. With a graceful flick of his wand, a long ribbon of gold light erupted into the air, weaving itself into glowing lines of text above the table. Dumbledore beamed at the hall full of students. Choose whatever melody you like, he announced. On my mark, sing. An eager murmur raced through the dining hall, then everyone launched into song. Hogwarts, 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 grant us knowledge, nay, far and far. Whether we're bald old professors or the child who scraped his knee, our minds are ready to welcome something new. For now our heads are empty, filled with air, dead flies, and dust. So teach us what is precious, restore what we have lost, and give it back to us. We'll give our very best and leave the rest to chance. We'll study night and day until our brains are crammed. Most students sang with practiced seriousness, though a few mischievous voices slipped in the well-known tune of a certain blue robot cat. Harry tapped his foot in time. Ron couldn't resist joining the chorus, and even Hermione found herself humming along by the final verse. As the last notes faded, Professor Dumbledore's eyes twinkled in approval. And, at last, everyone headed off to bed. Only the Weasley twins kept pace with the funeral march's slow, solemn theme, though by the grin they exchanged, you'd never guess they weren't itching to join the Doraemon quartet. Maybe they'd held back because the prank hadn't been their idea. In any case, A quick flourish of Dumbledore's wand cued them for the final bars, and when they hit the last note, the headmaster was the first to leap to his feet, clapping so loudly the rafters seemed to echo. "Music," he said, dabbing at his eyes, "is more enchanting than anything else we do here. Now, off to bed. Back to your dormitories." Ryan, the new Ravenclaw first year, fell in step behind Penello, pushing through the chattering throng that poured out of the great hall. Below them, the fresh Slytherins and Hufflepuffs were winding down to their basement common rooms. All around, yawns stretched wide. The feast had been generous, and heavy eyelids were plain proof of it. The little wizards trudged onward, as if their legs had turned to lead. It wasn't long before they arrived at the 6th-floor landing, where the arched doorway to Ravenclaw Tower stood waiting. Passing rows of gleaming armor and rounding one last corner, Ryan and the others finally came face to face with the familiar spiral staircase, its stone steps winding upward into the tower's shadowy heights. We climbed and climbed, the steps winding so steeply that almost everyone was dripping with sweat. The dizzying spiral tested our endurance, but at last we emerged onto a landing dominated by a simple wooden door. An ornate bronze door knocker in the shape of an eagle gleamed at eye level. Prefect Penelope Clivot stepped forward, her slender fingers brushing the eagle's beak before she rapped sharply on the door. Immediately, the eagle's beak snapped open, and instead of a raucous bird call, a gentle musical voice issued forth. "Where do vanished things go?" Penelope turned back to us with a warm smile. "Welcome to Ravenclaw House," she announced softly, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm Prefect Penelope Clivat. You've just reached the entrance to our common room, the haven of the wisest witches and wizards, just as our founder, Rowena Ravenclaw, intended." She gestured toward the knocker. "To get in, you must simply tap the eagle and answer its riddle. Speak the correct answer, and you'll be admitted." She faced the door again, and the knocker repeated its question, its tone patient and curious. "Where do vanished things go?" Without hesitation, Penelope replied, "They return to nothingness, yet from nothingness they become everything." The wooden door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing the warm glow of the Ravenclaw common room beyond. We stepped forward, ready to join the house of wit and learning. The first-year students followed closely behind Professor Penello and found themselves in a vast circular chamber. Elegant arched windows, dressed in blue and bronze silk drapes, rose high on every wall. Above them, the domed ceiling was painted with glittering constellations, and beneath their feet lay a deep star-spangled carpet. Tables, chairs, and bookshelves filled the room, giving it the cozy hush of a grand library. Opposite the entrance, a statue stood in a recessed alcove. Aside it was a single door leading to the dormitories. Without fanfare or lengthy introductions, Penello motioned the girls forward and led them through that door. He then ushered the boys through a second door. Inside, a spiral staircase wound upward. At the top of the stairs, each student found a four-poster bed draped in dark blue hangings and colorful flannel curtains. Above each bed, a brass nameplate gleamed with its owner's name in gold letters. Weary from their journey, the new wizards changed into pajamas and slipped beneath the soft flannel drapes. Ryan's bed stood tucked into a corner, right beside Harry's and Ron's. With a final sleepy glance at one another, they drifted off to sleep, ready to begin their first night at Hogwarts. Chapter 87. Peter Pettigrew. Silence had settled over Ravenclaw Tower. The students were asleep, and all was still, except for the small, twitching shape of Scabbers in the corner. No one suspected that this ordinary-looking rat was anything but harmless. But Ryan knew better. With a silent thought, he unleashed his magic. Invisible threads of power spiraled around the sleeping rodent, binding it in place. Scabbers squeaked, his furry form convulsing under the enchantment. Then, as Ryan held his concentration, the rat's body seemed to dissolve into mist. From the haze emerged the true form of Peter Pettigrew, a bald, middle-aged man with small, watery eyes and a hawk-like nose, his spirit freed from its furry prison. At that moment, the Marauder's map in Ryan's hand flickered. The name Peter Pettigrew that had been scrawled across it blurred and vanished into a cluster of inky dots, proof of Pettigrew's unmasking. Deep within the tower's stone walls, an almost inaudible creak signaled the opening of a hidden door. It was the secret passage linking Ravenclaw Tower to the castle's forgotten dungeons. A pale, bluish light spilled through the threshold as a spectral figure, the rational spirit of the rat wizard's magic, materialized before Ryan. Without warning, Ryan felt a pull like a magnet drawing him toward the dungeon below. He followed the ghostly guide through the narrow corridor until they stood before an ancient stone reliquary. The lid shuddered, cracked, and then yawned open. Before he could react, a silent force seized Pettigrew's astral form and dragged it into the reliquary's depths. With a final echoing snap, the heavy stone lid slammed shut, sealing Peter Pettigrew's spirit inside. The corridor fell deathly quiet once more. This time, truly empty. Something like glowing circuit diagrams crept across the polished box's surface. Then, with a sharp crack, the lid snapped shut. Ryan pressed his lips together and thought, if Sirius insists on becoming a mouse, fine. He'll at least be a wizard's mouse, with a wizard's lifespan to match. He'd let Sirius make his break from Azkaban, let him stagger out thirsty, starving, and hunted by the Aurors. Only then would Ryan slip in, recover Peter Pettigrew's stray spirit, and return it to its rat form, leaving Professor Dumbledore to sort out the rest. He wasn't Sirius's keeper, or his father, and frankly, if Sirius wanted to rot behind bars for a few more years, who was he to complain? That night, back in Ravenclaw Tower, a familiar figure emerged from an ink painting beside Ryan's four-poster bed. The young man was impossibly handsome, dark hair combed back from a high forehead, thoughtful gray eyes, and the deep blue robes threaded with Ravenclaw gold. He paused in the lamplight, scanned the empty dormitory, then drifted toward the spiral staircase. Ryan slipped the sealed box into an inner pocket of his robe and rose. He passed a lone housemate sprawled on a bench, head buried in a hefty book. The Ravenclaw never looked up, as if Ryan were merely part of the decor. They threaded down the dizzying spiral stairs, swung around the landing, and climbed again, floor after floor, until they reached the 8th story. There, opposite a tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy in mid-panic, a troll's overgrown fists rained blows on the hapless wizard. In the tapestry's magic, each punch made Barnabas's painted robes swirl and his features contort, fresh bruises blooming thread by thread. Ryan halted on the cold flagstones, watching the prefect vanish into the shadow beyond the tapestry. His plan was in motion. Sirius would break free, he'd reclaim Pettigrew's spirit, and then, it was someone else's problem. He tucked his hands into his sleeves, took a steadying breath, and waited. Ryan had paced the corridor 3 times, rehearsing every detail of their upcoming date, when suddenly a seamless panel appeared in the plastered wall. He pressed his palm to its surface, and effortlessly it slid open. Stepping through, he eased the door shut behind him. In an instant, the wall reset at itself as if nothing out of the ordinary had ever occurred. Before him lay a cozy boudoir bathed in warm pink light. At its center stood a vast, rose-colored sofa, upon which Penelo and Kate lounged, each absorbed in a thick, leather-bound volume. They flipped pages in unison, so quietly and serenely that Ryan nearly doubted his eyes. "Penelo?" he ventured, his voice echoing strangely in the hush. She lifted an eyebrow, blinked, and turned another page. No sign she'd heard him. "Kate?" he tried again. Kate's ears twitched. She glanced his way, expression cool, then continued reading. A headache pounded at his temples. "Weren't you two the ones who told me to act as if we'd never met at school?" he demanded, forcing patience into his tone. Without a word, Penelo snapped her book shut and hurled it at the plush carpet, the cover thudding against the blossoms embroidered into the fabric. "I told you, I don't want you showing up here anymore." Kate marked her place, shut her own tome with a crisp click, and leveled a steely gaze on him. "And do you happen to know who Hermione Granger is?" Ryan exhaled, shoulders slumping. Over the next hour, he sifted through every sincere phrase he had, offering apologies, reassurances, and sweet promises. Bit by bit, their defenses softened. By the time he ran out of words, the 3 of them sat in companionable quiet, the tension of the moment gently dissolved. Ryan could hardly believe his own potential. No matter what obstacle stood in his way, he always managed to talk his way through it. Was he really the timid, socially anxious kid he'd been in his previous life? After a few simple gestures, Penelo and Kate, both still just ordinary girls in terms of sheer physical strength, stepped out of the room of requirement. At the same moment, they drew their wands and cast the disapparition charm on themselves. In an instant, they vanished, and Ryan, following the prearranged coordinates they'd set, reappeared back in the Ravenclaw dormitory. The next morning, the first rays of dawn filtered through the dark blue curtains, warming Ryan's face. He slipped into his school uniform and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The lighting in the Ravenclaw common room was exceptional, soft enough to wake you gently, bright enough to start the day. He peered out the window beside his four-poster. Below, the serene expanse of the Black Lake stretched out, completely deserted at this early hour. Beyond its misty surface loomed the forbidden forest, its ancient trees silent in the pale light. Off in the distance, near Hagrid's hut, a tall figure could be made out through the pre-dawn gloom. Back inside, the carpet underfoot was dotted with stars that mirrored the night sky, just like the rest of the common room, reminding Ryan that even before breakfast, magic was never far away. You lift your head and see only the curved ceiling of the dormitory's dome. This room holds 6 four-poster beds. Alongside Harry and Ron are Terry Boot, Michael Corner, and Anthony Goldstein, a lively household to say the least. What makes it even more curious is that if Harry had stayed in Gryffindor, his roommate would have been Dean Thomas, yet another of Ginny's ex-boyfriends. Even now that Harry's been reassigned to Ravenclaw, his roommate, Michael Corner, happens to be one of Ginny's former flames as well, and both Dean and Michael are black. Does Ginny have a type, or is this just an odd coincidence on Rowling's part? Interestingly, J.K. Rowling once drafted a fuller backstory for Dean Thomas, but she never found a place in the finished books to include it. An early version of Chamber of Secrets opened with Dean's tale, only to be cut so as not to upstage Neville or clutter the plot. In that draft, Dean believed he came from a purely Muggle family. He'd been raised by his mother and stepfather after his birth father left when Dean was still very young. Despite coming from a large blended household with many half-siblings, Dean's early years were warm and happy until Hogwarts pulled him into a world Hat would test him in ways he never imagined. When the letter from Hogwarts arrived, Ryan's mother couldn't help but wonder if his father was a wizard. No one, however, ever learned the truth. To protect his wife, his father never revealed his magical heritage and was later killed for refusing to join the Death Eaters. In the original timeline, Ryan would have unearthed all of this during his years at school, but in this new reality, that hidden story remains buried. Unfortunately, Ryan wasn't sorted into Gryffindor, so he had no natural reason to poke around the castle. He missed the familiar landmarks and key moments of his past life. They would have been such a comforting distraction in a world he didn't belong to. Instead, 3 years have come and gone, and he still sits alone on his four-poster, uninterested in facing the Great Hall by himself. Over time, Ryan has mastered the art of blending into the background. His uncanny aura of charm still exists, but now it's masked by a kind of magical invisibility. As long as he never stands alone, no one notices just how compelling he really is. With classmates bustling around him, he can enjoy his solitude without anyone guessing the truth. I knew that if I were suddenly summoned to answer questions or deal with yesterday's assignments, I'd be completely unprepared. To avoid any trouble, and since I didn't even need to eat, I decided to sit tight and wait it out. Chapter 88, Charms. They say environment shapes character, hence Mencius's mother moved 3 times in search of the ideal school. In the Ravenclaw common room, where almost every student was immersed in books, even Harry and Ron, once habitual homework copiers, found themselves studying and preparing for lessons. Of course, their sudden diligence might also have something to do with what happened at breakfast yesterday. Over there, do you see him? Where? Next to that tall, red-haired boy. That's Weasley with the Skywalker gold card. The one who wears glasses? Is he really selling it? I'd pay 20 galleons. Have you seen his face? And his scar? Don't worry about Harry. There's a whole semester left. Go corner Weasley. I'll go get the money. The following morning, Harry, Ron, and their friend Ryan made their way out of the dormitory toward the Great Hall. Whispered remarks followed in their wake, though most of the other students had already hurried down to Filch's office on the ground floor to petition for lifting the ban on bamboo dragonflies, bamboo horses, and underwater breathing tubes. Ron was enjoying the attention until he couldn't take it anymore. Under a steady onslaught of bribes, he ended up pawning his gold card again and again, much to his own embarrassment. Outside the classroom, crowds of students lined the corridor on tiptoe, eager to spot Harry's face and block Ron's path. Whenever the two of them walked by, curious onlookers would nudge each other, double back for a second look, even try to detain Ron for a moment. Dinner felt like a welcome escape, and Harry and Ron bolted back to the common room the moment they finished eating, only to find themselves stalled at the portrait door by the usual barrage of questions. Luckily, Ryan was right behind them in line and volunteered to tackle the doorkeeper's riddles, giving Harry and Ron time to slip inside. In truth, the Eagle Rings challenges were never particularly tough. They were mostly philosophical puzzles. If your reasoning was sound and your explanation plausible, you earned your passage. Monday morning began with Penelope distributing each first year's timetable. Unlike Gryffindor, whose first class was Transfiguration, their house started the day with charms. Each lesson lasted a full 2 hours, long enough to make Ryan squirm, but at least charms itself proved perfectly manageable. I'd heard there'd be a 10 to 20-minute break between classes, but Transfiguration and Potions ran right up against each other. At about 8:40 that morning, Ryan and his friends set off for charms on the 4th floor, clutching the enchanted map the Ravenclaw seniors had lent them. Even with Hermione leading the way, they didn't slip into the classroom until nearly 9 o'clock, just as Professor Flitwick was about to begin. Hogwarts is a maze. The castle contains 142 staircases, some broad and grand, others narrow and rickety. A handful even change their destinations every Friday. A few vanish halfway up, forcing you to leap at precisely the right spot or tumble back down. Doors are equally capricious. Ignore polite protocol or press the wrong panel and they refuse to open, while some doors are merely solid walls in disguise. To make matters worse, portraits flutter between frames with the latest gossip, suits of armor clank through corridors, and nothing ever stays where you left it. It took Ryan's group a full 10 minutes just to find the door marked Charms. Chapter 1. First Charms Lesson. The first challenge of the term was simply finding the Charms classroom. The door was notoriously finicky. Each time someone tried to open it, a ghost would burst out with a blood-curdling wail, sending prospective students stumbling backward. Thankfully, on the very first morning, the new Ravenclaws all assembled in the common room and set off together. Navigating the twisting corridors and leaping spirits as a group kept them on time. Alone, they'd surely have been late. Charms at Hogwarts is taught separately by house, and Professor Flitwick reserved his classroom for Ravenclaws only. As soon as the students settled into their seats, he bustled forward, carrying a parchment roster, and called the roll. When he reached Harry Potter, there was none of the wild excitement or fainting cries rumored to have occurred in other worlds. Harry merely stood and answered present in his soft, clear voice. Professor Flitwick himself was a diminutive figure, barely coming up to a tall student's shoulder. His pointed ears and sharp features hinted at goblin ancestry. Behind the lectern, he hopped onto a precarious stack of enchanted textbooks so everyone could see him. He began the lesson with a broad smile, outlining the definition of charms and explaining their common uses: illumination, unlocking, cleaning, and more. From time to time, he would flourish his wand, sending a bouquet of enchanted daisies dancing across the ceiling or turning the chalkboard into a flurry of moving diagrams to keep everyone's attention riveted on him. At precisely 10:20 a.m., he paused. "Take out your wands, please," he instructed in his chirping voice. Silence fell as each student withdrew their wooden core. "Our first incantation will be Lumos," he announced, raising his own wand so the tip glowed brightly. "This charm is indispensable for illuminating dark places. Watch closely." With that, the flickering blue light at the end of Professor Flitwick's wand cast the entire classroom into a gentle glow, and the first true lesson at Hogwarts began. Professor Flitwick tapped his wand lightly on the podium and smiled at the eager faces before him. "All right, class, on my count, Lumos. 1, 2, 3. A ripple of gentle light sprang to life at the tips of wands all around the Charms classroom. Tiny points of luminescence bobbed in the air like fireflies. "Excellent," Flitwick praised, flicking his wand to extinguish the glow. Michael, please keep your wand holstered until I give the signal. Remember, the wand lighting charm is straightforward, but it demands concentration. Over-channeling could scorch your wand, and that kind of damage is permanent. Now, for the counterspell. After I say it, all together. Nox! Darkness reclaimed the wand's tips in an instant. Most students beamed with satisfaction, having mastered both spells in only a few attempts. Flitwick drifted over to Neville Longbottom, who stood apart from the others, wand trembling in his grip, and no spark of light to show for his effort. "Neville," Flitwick said kindly, "have you run into a problem?" Neville swallowed. "Sir, this wand belonged to someone else, my grandmother's friend. I don't think it wants to work for me." Intrigued, Flitwick studied the pale wood and knobbly handle. Fascinating. A wand's allegiance is notoriously fickle. Before Flitwick could suggest a solution, a confident voice spoke up from the back row. "Professor, if you'll allow me." Ryan Smith stepped forward, waving his own wand. "I've been experimenting with a spell I call Transmogrificus Mentis. It temporarily persuades a wand that it's in the hands of its true owner." Flitwick raised an eyebrow, but nodded invitation. Ryan took a steadying breath, aimed at Neville's wand, and pronounced clearly, "Transmogrificus Mentis." Neville's eyes went wide. He raised his wand again. "Lumos!" This time a brilliant beam erupted from the tip. The entire class gasped as the light hovered, unwavering. "Remarkable," Professor Flitwick exclaimed, clapping his hands together. "Smith, that is an extraordinary innovation. Even if it's only temporary, it could open new avenues in wand lore." Neville beamed, relief washing over him as he lowered his illuminated wand. Around the room, students erupted into quiet applause, eager to see what new charms the term would bring. Professor Flitwick straightened at his desk and grinned. "Very well, everyone. Get some rest. Tomorrow we delve deeper into the protean charm. Class dismissed." Professor Flitwick cleared his throat and held up his wand. "Remember, a core of unicorn, N-tail hair produces the most loyal wand of all. Unless its original owner explicitly transfers ownership, the wand will refuse to work for anyone else, and may even sabotage its new master." A hand shot up. "Professor," said Ryan Smith, "Neville might need a new wand, one that's better suited to him." Neville Longbottom's face went pale. "My grandmother," Flitwick offered him a kind smile. "Don't worry, Neville, I'll write to Mrs. Longbottom to explain the situation." He tapped his notes, then brightened. "And 10 points to Ravenclaw. Thank you, Smith, for reminding us how crucial the right wand truly is." Clearing his throat again, Flitwick glanced around the classroom. "Now, I mentioned that there are several variants of the wand lighting charm. Who can name them and explain their uses?" "Miss Granger?" Almost before he finished speaking, Hermione raised her hand eagerly, ready to demonstrate her knowledge. Hermione paused to straighten her notes, then looked up at the class. "Lumos has an upgraded version called Lumos Maxima. It produces a far larger, brighter beam. Think of it as a magical flashlight. There's also Lumos Solemn, which emits pure sunlight. It's particularly useful against creatures vulnerable to daylight." She glanced at the clock. "All right, Ravenclaw, 3 points to you. Ms. Granger, I believe you've demonstrated more than enough mastery of the variants." With a quick flick of her wand, she added, "For tonight's homework, write an essay on Lumos and its effects, no fewer than 7 sentences. Class dismissed." 11 o'clock already. The students spilled out of the classroom, bellies rumbling at the thought of lunch. They hurried toward the great hall, eager to fuel up before afternoon herbology and transfiguration. "Ryan, take a look at my wand," Ron said, jabbing a thumb at his pocket, his brow creased with worry. Ryan peered at the polished wood. "Honestly, it's bonded to you just fine. Nothing seriously wrong. But someday, you might consider getting a wand made just for you." Ron nodded, though his fingers still drummed nervously against his side as they quickened their pace toward dinner. Chapter 89, Hateful Malfoy. After lunch, Harry glanced at his watch. Almost 1 o'clock. It was time for herbology. He and Ron left the great hall and cut across the school's vegetable garden toward the greenhouses. Today's lesson was shared between Ravenclaw and Slytherin, which meant students from both houses were already gathering among the glass panes. As they neared the entrance, they spotted Draco Malfoy laughing with his usual cronies, Crabbe and Goyle. The moment he noticed Harry, Malfoy straightened his robes, flicked an imaginary bit of lint from his sleeve and squared his shoulders as if preparing to address a royal court. "Hello, Potter," Malfoy drawled, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "I'm so relieved you weren't sorted into that ridiculously brave Gryffindor. As a Ravenclaw, surely you appreciate knowing who's truly worthy of friendship." He strolled toward them in slow motion, every syllable pronounced as if he were performing some aristocratic aria. Harry's jaw clenched. He hated Malfoy's condescension. "Shut up, Draco," he snapped. Ron stepped forward, his face flushed. "Yeah, go bother someone else with your stupid name." Malfoy sneered, but before he could fire back, Professor Sprout emerged from the greenhouse doorway, calling for everyone to find a planting station. The tension broke as the students scrambled inside, pots and trowels in hand, leaving Malfoy to scowl after Harry and Ron as they settled at a long, work-worn bench. If you're as handsome as the author claims to be, you'd probably laugh off any insult. But everyone has a sore spot, one thing that really stings, and for Draco, it was his name. Draco isn't exactly common, and in Latin it means dragon, fitting the Malfoys' habit of naming children after celestial phenomena. Their surname, too, comes from the French malfoi, bad faith or dishonesty, and even sounds a bit like malformation. Imagine meeting someone for the first time and hearing, "Nice to meet you, I'm a deformed dragon." No wonder Draco's cheeks, normally pale as moonlight, heated up. Drawing himself up, Draco leveled a cool stare at his interlocutor. "Oh, isn't this Ronald Weasley?" he said slowly, emphasizing each word. "The one with enough siblings to start his own Quidditch team at home?" Ronald snorted. "Let me see. Your wand's practically an antique. What new toy have you got to show off today?" Draco's gray eyes glittered with mock innocence. "A gold card?" He let the words hang, then arched an eyebrow. "Isn't that something you just happened to stumble into by luck?" At the jab, Ron's face flared red, but Draco didn't wait to see if he'd rise to the bait. With a quiet flick of his cloak, he turned on his heel and walked back down the corridor, every inch the haughty heir to the Malfoy name. "I think you've just squandered the last of your good luck," Malfoy sneered. "Cross me, and that's when your luck runs dry," he added, nodding to Crabbe and Goyle. "Go!" Before they could move, a diminutive witch in a patched, dirt-streaked hat and grimy robes stepped forward. "Excuse me, children, what do you think you're doing?" Malfoy dipped his head in mock courtesy, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, forgive us, Professor." He allowed his gaze to drift over the tattered patches on her hat and the mud beneath her fingernails, then tossed a mock heroic wink at Crabbe and Goyle. Satisfied, he melted back into the Slytherin cluster. "He's unbearable. Did you see the look in his eyes?" Terry Boot muttered to Harry, crossing his arms. Harry let out a long sigh. "I honestly wish I'd never crossed paths with him. He's every bit as insufferable as Dudley." Ron gave Harry's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Come on, mate. Next time, just tell him he reminds you of that bully Darth Vader. Fat Tiger, you know?" They reached the professor, who was now beckoning Ryan and his friends over. Across the hall, Malfoy fixed Ron with a venomous stare, his smile twisting into something far more sinister. Professor Sprout swept into the greenhouse with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Pomona Sprout, your herbology instructor. This term, we'll be working with some truly dangerous and wonderfully magical plants. I'll teach you how to cultivate them, how to handle them safely, and how to put their unique properties to use. Herbology is one of the most valuable skills you'll take into the wizarding world, so I expect your full attention. A single misstep might cost you far more than just a few points on your grade sheet." With that, she nodded to the house teams. Today's assignment was to plant and tend what she called white fresh grass, a rare herb prized for its strong healing properties in potion making. Ryan and his group found themselves paired with a cluster of Slytherins, each student kneeling at a soil-filled tray, dragonhide gloves stretched tight over their fingers. Ryan quickly discovered one of the best things about herbology, a full 30-minute break between classes. That was unheard of in potions or transfiguration, where back-to-back lessons left barely time to catch your breath. By 3 o'clock, the 2-hour lesson drew to a close. Ryan peeled off his gloves to find his hands almost and unusually clean. The others, however, were caked in dust and potting mix. None of them had dared to cast the cleanup charm. The The spell was considered somewhat advanced for first years, and besides, they'd been so engrossed in their plants that magic didn't occur to them. As soon as Professor Sprout dismissed the class, everyone shot to their feet, covered in grit but beaming with relief, and headed straight for the castle's bathrooms. A long, hot wash sounded far more appealing than any spell right about then, even if they knew how to cast it. Keeping pace with the others was crucial, and Ryan hardly registered any attention, something he didn't particularly mind. Just then, Argus Filch appeared, grumbling about the castle's untidiness. "Filth everywhere, filth!" His voice rose to a shriek, and the skin on his double chin quivered with rage. A handful of first-year students hurried past, wands aloft, sweeping at the grime with simple cleaning charms. Filch's face turned an even darker shade. "No magic in the corridors," he bellowed. "You lot, detention starts now. Follow me!" "He really is something else," Ron muttered as Filch herded the wide-eyed youngsters away. They were already cutting it fine for Transfiguration, which began at 3:30. After a quick wash in the nearest basin, Ryan and his friends made their way to the first-floor classroom. Inside, Professor McGonagall stood at the front, her posture as impeccable as ever. Though Ryan had secretly hoped she'd transform into a cat, perching on the desk before resuming her human form, she simply tapped her wand against her pocket watch and fixed the class with a cool, expectant gaze. "Transfiguration is the most complex and dangerous spell you will learn at Hogwarts," Professor McGonagall announced, eyes sweeping over the assembled students. "Anyone causing trouble in my classroom will be asked to leave and will never be permitted to return. Consider this your only warning." With a swift flick of her wand, she tapped her desk. The polished oak rippled and reshaped itself into a small pig, which squealed and trotted in a tight circle before McGonagall tapped it again and restored the desk to its original form. A soft murmur of excitement rippled through the room as countless wands were drawn, all eager to try Transfiguration immediately. "Not so fast," McGonagall said crisply, raising a gloved hand. "You'll do no more than take notes until I say otherwise." She slid to the front of the classroom and, for the next hour, guided the students through a series of complex diagrams and precise incantations. Every quill dipped in ink, scratched across parchment as they recorded the pitfalls and prerequisites of safe Transfiguration practice. At 4:30, the moment of reckoning arrived. Professor McGonagall passed out a single match to each student. "Your assignment," she instructed, "is to turn that match into a needle. Apply everything we've covered today." The absence of Seamus Finnegan, the class's resident explosion specialist, kept the room mercifully calm. Neville fidgeted with the match, Ron paced the back row, and Harry sat beside Hermione, offering quiet encouragement. Leaning over, Ron whispered a few pointers to her, while Hermione's brow furrowed in concentration. She murmured the incantation, "Transfigure," and felt the hairs on her arms rise as magic coursed through her wand. The matchstick shrank and stretched. The wooden head evaporated, replaced by a fine metallic point. Hermione held her breath until the transformation finalized, revealing a slender needle between her fingers. Professor McGonagall's stern facade melted into genuine approval. "Excellent work, Miss Granger. That is exactly how it should look." A ripple of applause followed, and Hermione allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The arduous lesson had paid off, and Hogwarts had witnessed a flawless transfiguration at last. Professor McGonagall pursed her lips. "Granger, you mastered the transformation in our first exercise. 5 points to Ravenclaw." Ron jumped up, leading his table in enthusiastic applause. Beside Hermione, Lisa Dupin, her chestnut hair pulled into a messy bun, flicked her eyes toward Hermione and whispered urgent questions about her technique. But Hermione barely heard her. She was still absorbing the moment. At 5:30, the day's lesson came to an end. Before dismissing the class, Professor McGonagall added, "Everyone except Miss Granger will write a 10-inch article on today's Transfiguration exercise for tomorrow's homework." Hermione almost shot her hand into the air, eager to volunteer to write the essay herself so her classmates could be spared. Fortunately, Ryan nudged her gently in the rib, reminding her to let everyone tackle their own assignments. With that, the students gathered their belongings and streamed out of the classroom, chattering excitedly about Hermione's remarkable demonstration. Chapter 90, Launch announcement. My editor just let me know the novel goes live tomorrow. This is my first time writing a book, signing a contract, and seeing it published, so I'm still learning the ropes. Because of that, tomorrow's update might arrive a bit later than the usual 10:30 a.m. Once the book is officially on the shelves, I'll be uploading 2 updates each day. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and if you have questions or feedback, drop them in the comments. P.S. The editor also mentioned that after 12 p.m. tomorrow, I'll be able to post VIP coupons in the background. Chapter 91, Ryan's Data. Ron stared in dismay at his blank parchment. 7 inches of text. How am I even supposed to fill that much? He groaned, rubbing his eyes. Harry leaned back in his chair, quill poised but motionless. Don't remind me. Even if we list every step and safety precaution for conjuring a fluorescent light spell, we won't get past 3 inches. It was just after dinner. In Ravenclaw, the second years, mostly returning students, tended to stick together. Because the house boasted its own well-stocked library and enrolled few freshmen, everyone naturally traveled to and from meals as a group. Tonight, they'd planned to slip over to Filch's office after dinner, hoping for a clandestine peek at the 3 confiscated novelty items that had caused such a stir in the corridors. But Ron didn't have the galleons to buy any trinket, and Harry couldn't spare the money either, so they'd reluctantly shelved the idea and returned to the common room to tackle their homework. Ravenclaws had a reputation for being unsociable with the other houses. Outside of class, they preferred the hush of their library and the warm glow of the common room's firelight to mingling in Gryffindor's tumultuous tower or Hufflepuff's bustling kitchens. Now, Ron and Harry sat under the watchful eyes of the quill and parchment portrait, both worried and uninspired. 15 minutes ticked by, and still not even an inch of parchment was covered. I don't know where to begin, Ron admitted with a sigh. Nor do I, Harry agreed, staring at the empty page and wishing inspiration would strike. Harry stared down at his parchment, frustration mounting. He held a ruler alongside his lines of text, trying to hit the 7-inch minimum his essay needed. The flickering glow of the common room fire danced across his face as he measured again, and this time the writing just reached 7 inches. Finally, he muttered, sliding the ruler aside. Across the round table, Ryan was locked in a fierce duel of wits with Kate and Pinello, an intricate game of conjured daggers and shields waged entirely in the mind. Harry raised a hand, and Ryan paused mid-strike, phantom blade frozen in midair. Ryan, Harry said, leaning forward, do you know how to actually write this essay? I'm still not sure it's enough. Ryan sheathed his imaginary weapon and gave Harry a thoughtful look. You mean the homework on advanced curses? Just explain how you tackled the topic, your learning process, your guesses, any mistakes you made. If you're worried you'll fall short on length, simply write in a larger script or expand your margins. Hermione, perched beside Harry with her quill poised, stiffened. That's cheating, she said sharply. It's not, Ron quipped from his armchair, grinning. Widening your margins is perfectly legitimate. Harry hesitated. Is there anything else I can do? Ryan smiled, folding his arms. The real challenge is pulling the essential information out of your sources and then putting it entirely in your own words. That shows you understand it. He slid out of his chair and strode to the low bookshelf by the fireplace. After a moment of searching, he plucked a well-worn volume from the shelf. Take this, he said, handing the book to Harry. The cover read, The Evolution of the Curse. It's an accessible introduction. Pick a chapter, say the one on minor jinxes, read it thoroughly, then summarize the key points as though you're teaching someone else. Don't copy the text, restate the ideas in your own style, and note which pages you used. Harry took the book, eyes bright. Hermione huffed but bent back to her work, while Ron rifled through his parchment. Harry opened the volume to the table of contents, feeling a renewed spark of curiosity. With Ryan's advice in mind, he began reading, determined to turn raw knowledge into his own thoughtful analysis. Hermione tapped the open page of her textbook and began. See, lumos comes from the Latin lumen, light, and before that from the Proto-Indo-European root luke, which also means light. Lots of English words share that ancestry. She flipped a few pages and continued, Right here are the closest relatives of lumos, luminous. the adjective meaning shining, illuminate, meaning to light up or make clear, illustration, originally a shedding of light and now an example or picture that clarifies, elucidate, to make something clear, translucent, letting light through but not fully transparent, and lucid, expressed clearly, easy to understand. Hermione looked up at Harry. All I want you to do is use this etymological logic as your guide. Skim through the text, piece together the context from what you now know, and then translate it into your own words. She pointed to page 23 of the Evolution of Curses. Start here, she said encouragingly. Near her, Harry sat forward eagerly. Ron nudged in, curious to see what all the fuss was about, and Neville edged over too. Across the table, Terry Boot, Michael Corner, and Anthony Goldstein had already finished their assignments and were lost in books of their own. Harry closed his notes, picked up the Evolution of Curses, and began to read, this time armed with Hermione's etymological lifeline. Ryan's know-it-all reputation wouldn't have raised an eyebrow in Ravenclaw. After all, Ravenclaws live for knowledge. They relish every book that sparks their curiosity. Yet Ryan couldn't afford to ponder house stereotypes right now because he was juggling two very different challenges at once. Hermione, sensing his divided attention, swooped in again and peppered him with rapid-fire questions. At the same time, he was deep in the thinking game with Kate and Penny, plotting their next move. Across the game's ancient martial arts storyline, the legendary Luo Xingxia, champion of justice, made her bold entrance. Despite Hermione's relentless interrogation and the evolving drama on the game board, Ryan had far more pressing matters weighing on his mind. Ryan stared at the translucent runic display hovering in the air before him. The spell tracker he'd spent years refining finally revealed his true potential. Race, wizard. Strength, 33, normal human cap, 10. Constitution, 41, normal human cap. Magic power, 30, normal human cap, 10. Skills, critical thinking, level 5, 67%. Body transformation, 45%. Alchemy, level 4, 27%. Charms, level 5, 22%. Potions, level 3, 31%. Transfiguration, level 4. Magical biology, level 3, 50. Gunfighting. Martial arts, level 36%. Investigation, level 4, 9%. Phoenix incarnation, level 4, 7%. Mind communication, level 24%. Love magic, level 2, 1%. No ordinary wizard ever boasted such numbers. After 3 years of painstaking research and cross-referencing the rare data available on underwater wizards, Ryan had confirmed that a typical adult magician's magic power hovered around 20, with virtually none breaking 30. Even the most accomplished sorcerers only excelled in spellcasting quality. Their raw physical strength remained on par with non-magical humans, both topping out below 10. Where wizards truly outclassed muggles was in constitution, roughly twice as durable, at around 20 points. This translated not into brute force, but in remarkable magic resistance and vitality. Thanks to their enhanced resilience, they seldom perished from high-speed Quidditch crashes and could shrug off minor dark charms that would incapacitate an ordinary person. And yet, here was Ryan, shattering every known ceiling. His strength more than tripled that of a typical wizard. His constitution doubled even the underwater sorcerer's reputed toughness, and his magic power reached an unprecedented 30. It had taken countless sleepless nights and failed experiments, but at last he stood at the summit of wizarding potential. Now he only had to decide how to use it. Magic is deceptively fragile. In disciplines like charms and transfiguration, most wizards, apart from the rare aquatic spellcasters, struggle to advance beyond grade 3. Even that grade 3 is usually propped up by a single favored spell, or trop, figuration trick, honed to grade 4. As a result, such wizards are surprisingly predictable. Find a way to counter their one-mastered incantation, and they collapse. By contrast, a Ravenclaw graduate or any witch or wizard of similar breadth is far more resilient. Instead of relying on a lone specialty, they draw on a repertoire of spells, shifting tactics at will. That versatility is precisely why Professor Flitwick holds the dueling crown. With dozens of charms at his command, he presents no single weak point for an opponent to exploit. Yet even this level of skill pales beside the threshold of grade 6. It lies beyond the reach of mere mortals. Reaching it demands nothing short of a miracle born of relentless effort. This is why Albus Dumbledore always downplayed rote learning and extolled the power of love. For only love, or more broadly, the strength of the heart, can propel a witch or wizard into that highest realm. Once one achieves grade 6, any remaining gaps in knowledge can be calmly identified and bridged, completing the journey to true mastery. Build your own fighting style around a core level 6 spell. This is the time to learn and refine yourself. That was Dumbledore's guiding principle, the very training regimen he'd planned for Harry in the original world line. Now, as he prepared to tutor Ravenclaw's Harry, what new lessons would the headmaster devise? Ryan shook his head, dismissing the thought. From his vantage, Voldemort was little more than a long-dead skeleton in a tomb. If Ryan so chose, he could shatter every Horcrux in a single day. Yet he hadn't. Deep down, he still feared a trap. He had far more to achieve before confronting the Dark Lord's legacy, so he set the matter aside. What held Ryan's fascination instead was a skill he'd recently acquired from Harry: love. It was the very reason he lingered at Harry's side, almost to the point of obsession. The power of this skill was extraordinary. At level 2, it bolstered any spell below level 4 by 2 tiers, and even let level 4 incantations perform with level 6 potency. In effect, Ryan had become one of the rare wizards capable of wielding level 6 magic, matching, or even surpassing, Dumbledore himself. Ryan's unease stemmed from the fact that, in the entire wizarding world, he and Voldemort were the two closest to reaching level 7. Dumbledore, for his part, relied almost entirely on his encyclopedic knowledge of magic. With the Elder Wand in his possession, he not only approached level 7, he may well have surpassed it. Voldemort, by contrast, had cheated death itself through Horcruxes and through countless dark magical transformations. His raw spell power hovered just below Dumbledore's, firmly at level 6, tantalizingly close to level 7, but not quite there. Chapter 92. Moon City's new directive night had already fallen by the time the common room clock struck 10. With Hermione's and Ryan's help, Harry, Ron, and the others had just wrapped up their triple bill of evening classes: Charms, Transfiguration, and Herbology. Slumping out of their stools, they greeted the sudden quiet with a collective stretch. Ron and Neville immediately set up a wizard's chessboard on a low table, launching straight into their fierce, silent battle. Harry, meanwhile, sank into an armchair, eager to dig into the remaining Doraemon volumes Ron had smuggled in from the Muggle world. Across the room, Hermione and Lisa Dupin pored over parchment and stacked books, quizzing one another on tomorrow's arithmancy assignment. Just then, Anthony strode into the lounge, followed by Michael Connor, Terry Boot, and the rest of their group, all wearing worried expressions. "Bad news," Anthony announced, dropping onto the sofa. "The bamboo dragonflies, bamboo horses, and underwater breathing tubes we ordered aren't being released." Michael stepped forward. "Why not?" Harry, Ron, and Neville all blurted the same question. "Why?" Terry ran a hand through his hair. "They're blaming shoddy knockoffs. You know Skywalker Alchemy Workshop's official toys cost a fortune, so half the students can't afford them and end up buying pirated versions from Borgin and Bork." "Pirated toys are dangerous," Anthony added, folding his arms. "Last year Angelina Johnson nearly broke her neck when her bamboo dragonfly went haywire." Harry's green eyes went wide. "So if they can't stop the counterfeit stuff, they'll just ban the real gear altogether?" He glanced around the circle. "Isn't Borgin and Bork down in Nocturne Alley?" A tense silence fell over the room as everyone waited to see where this would lead. The crackdown on pirated magical toys threatened not just their late-night races around the lake, but the freedom to tinker, experiment, and enjoy a bit of pre-adult mischief in Moon City. "How on earth did people manage to buy those?" Neville asked out of the blue, his brow furrowed in genuine curiosity. He'd always been a bit insecure about his magic, attributing most of his mishaps to a subpar wand, so the idea of cornering a market intrigued him. "My dad says that Borgin and Burke's owner smelled a business opportunity the moment Doraemon hit the wizarding market," Ron explained, leaning back against the table. "He snapped up a handful of shops in Diagon Alley and started hawking Doraemon props magically duplicated straight from the show. Sure, they're cheap, about 1/10 of what Skywalker Alchemy Workshop charges, but they're shoddy," Anthony added with a grimace. "No warranty, highly unstable." If you ask me, I'd much rather buy the real, licensed stuff at Zonko's than pirate it from Borgin and Burke. Ron waved a hand dismissively. I was hoping to use one of those snorkels to dive into the Black Lake. I hear there are mermaids down there. No fair, we've got Slytherins who can just swim underwater all the time. He paused, cheeks reddening as he realized he didn't actually own a snorkel, or the galleons to afford one. Before anyone could tease him further, yawns spread around the table. We've got classes tomorrow, Anthony pointed out, rubbing his eyes. With a chorus of goodnights, they packed up their things and headed back to the Gryffindor dormitory, each secretly looking forward to a few hours' rest. Ryan dissolved into mist and reformed within the grand hall of Smith Castle. He reached down and absently stroked the little black cat, Jerry, purring at his touch. Concentrating for a moment, he whispered an incantation to his divine patron, the Lord God, and shifted into a different guise. On the castle's eastern flank, a freshly hewn cavern glowed with lantern light. Intricate alchemical sigils pulsed across the rough-hewn walls. In his new form, Ryan simply stepped through the air and appeared inside. Jack, he called. How many orders do we have for the anywhere door right now? A shadow detached itself from the far wall and solidified into Jack, Ryan's ever-faithful apprentice. Bowing deeply, Jack replied, Master, only one. It came from Moon City. Because it's so distant from Earth, they've requested an extra-large portal. And since their chain gold automaton can only follow rigid directives, progress has been slow. It's been nearly a month, and it's still unfinished. Ryan leaned against a rough stone pillar, frowning. The Moon City wizards, they're excessively cautious. I'm hardly a scourge, yet they insist on routing all dealings through Atlantis, and only now bother to commission a portal. Jack shrugged apologetically. They've always been secretive, Master. Ryan's eyes drifted upward, as if peering through the cavern's ceiling into the starry void beyond. It makes me wonder, he mused, if there are other wizard enclaves out there, on Mars, Venus, Mercury, even Jupiter. The Moon City sorcerers are the closest we've found to this cosmic mystery so far. He paused, fingers tapping against the stone. I intend to find out who else is hiding among the planets. Jack, I'll handle the final step of the portal myself. Ryan rubbed his chin and smiled. A moment later, the invisible currents of his magic coalesced into a glowing blue orb. Intricate runes and arcane sigils sprang into being in the empty air, outlining a massive framework of power. With a low rumble, the ancient lord of Smith Castle pulled open the gateway to another realm. From the void poured gleaming veins of ore that melted into swirling, jewel-toned liquids. Then, piece by piece, a colossal bronze gate, its frame stretching hundreds of feet tall, assembled itself before them. Make sure you install this in the canyon's teleportation array at dawn tomorrow, Ryan instructed Jack. I'm eager to explore a more magnificent world beyond. At his command, the two Ryans blended seamlessly into one. After sharing a final game of tag with Jerry the homunculus, Ryan's figure dissolved in a shimmer of light and reformed in the corridor of Smith Castle. Within the span of a heartbeat, he was standing in the Ravenclaw Tower dormitory, now clad in soft pajamas. The tower lay silent. All his fellow students were fast asleep. The next morning, Harry and the others stumbled bleary-eyed into the great hall, still half dreaming, unaware of the extraordinary gateway awaiting completion at the canyon below. Below the bewitched ceiling, the 4 long house tables were piled high with steaming bowls of porridge, platters of pickled herring, stacks of thick brown bread, and generous helpings of eggs and bacon. Harry and his friends took their seats at the Ravenclaw table, settling in beside their classmate Ryan, who was carefully balancing a copy of the Daily Prophet on top of a tilted milk jug. Across from them, Neville Longbottom was positively glowing with excitement. His round cheeks were flushed as he announced, "The postman's due, any minute now. Grandma's promised to call me as soon as my new wand arrives." Harry was just raising a spoonful of porridge to his mouth when Ryan, ever watchful, discreetly tapped his wand against the wooden tabletop. Harry and Neville exchanged curious looks. Then the air above the hall exploded with motion. Hundreds of owls swept in through the enchanted window panes, their wings beating in unison. They spiraled over the tables, dropping letters and packages into the outstretched hands of eager students. A flurry of downy feathers and a fine layer of owl dust drifted toward them. For a moment, Harry's heart sank at the thought of having his breakfast ruined. Then, with a soft pop and a shimmer of magic, every stray feather and mote of dust vanished into thin air. The great hall fell silent with astonishment, and Harry couldn't help but grin at Ryan. "Thanks for that," he mouthed, giving his friend a thumbs up. Ryan simply slipped his wand back inside his robes, a modest smile on his face. Neville, still beaming, returned his attention to the entrance, hopeful eyes scanning for the postman. Harry, spoon in hand once more, leaned back and enjoyed the rest of his breakfast. Hogwarts always had a way of making even the simplest meal feel like the start of an extraordinary day. A sudden thump caught Neville off guard as a heavy parcel landed on his head. Then another, equally large and gray, fell at his feet. But Ryan, sharp-eyed and quicker still, swept his wand in a graceful arc. Both packages lifted smoothly into the air and hovered behind him. "Errol!" Ron gasped, hurrying forward to cradle the exhausted owl and lower him gently onto the table. The poor bird lay sprawled on his back, legs flailing, still clutching a letter in his beak. "Here, old boy," Ron murmured, placing a shallow dish of milk and a strip of bacon in front of Errol. Carefully, he pried the envelope from the owl's beak and passed it to Hermione. "Don't worry," she said softly, brushing a finger over Errol's ruffled feathers. "He'll be all right." Ron cleared his throat and began to read the letter aloud. "I never expected you to be sorted into Ravenclaw. At last, some brains in the family. They say old unicorn hair wands can be rather stubborn in new hands. Since we're on friendly terms with Mrs. Longbottom, this Saturday we'll come up to Hogwarts to collect you and Neville. We'll make a quick trip down to Diagon Alley and find each of you a wand that truly suits you. And Ron, please don't press Neville about what happened that night. Some things are better left unasked." When Ron finished, he looked up at Ryan and Hermione. A trip to Diagon Alley awaited them this weekend, and with it a chance to choose wands of their very own. Ron's cheeks went pink. I know. I've already asked," he mumbled. "Really, don't worry about it," Harry said, offering a comforting smile. "When Saturday comes around, I'll ask Mum if you and Neville can tag along with me." Ron grinned, and Neville nodded in agreement. Chapter 93. Professor Binns's glorious resume Peeves is a notorious nuisance, especially to first-year students, even more dreaded than locked doors or trap-filled staircases. He'll plop a wastepaper basket on your head, yank the carpet from under your feet, hurl chalk pellets, or sneak up behind you, grab your nose, and shriek, "Give me your nose," when you least expect it. Yet Harry and his friends have never endured these indignities. Their only knowledge of Peeves's antics comes from the Weasley twins' vivid and often exaggerated stories. The true reason lies with Ryan. Peeves, without realizing it, instinctively steers clear of him. Since Ryan spends nearly all his time with Harry's circle, Peeves has never dared, or perhaps never felt able, to target any of them. As a result, Harry and his companions stand alone among the four houses as the only first years Peeves has spared. This peculiar immunity has only fueled the legend of the boy who lived. Most students assume that the same mysterious power that defeated Voldemort when Harry was just an infant must also protect him against the castle's most mischievous poltergeist. According to rumor, Peeves has made repeated attempts to challenge Harry's reputation, but each time, something holds him back. Even Peeves, the notorious poltergeist, took the warning seriously, and for good reason. First, Ryan had reached level 4 in his Phoenix incarnation. At this height, no external spark was needed. A single thought would transform him. He could hide his mortal body within the blazing mental image of a phoenix. And phoenix magic is among the noblest and most formidable of all the magical arts. Subconsciously, Peeves knew it was unwise to provoke such power. The second reason for Peeves's sudden caution lay in the Lord God, the very furnace core of Smith Castle. Like Peeves himself, this entity had been refined and enslaved by Ryan. In fairy tale terms, the Lord God served as Ryan's second soul, an ally whose presence only reinforced the poltergeist's fear. No wonder Peeves melted away, leaving the corridors unnaturally quiet. With Peeves out of the picture, Ravenclaw's first-year students navigated the castle together without further mishap. After breakfast, Ron and Neville were grinning from ear to ear at the news that they would each be fitted for a new wand. In their excitement, they hurried to take the lead. only to realize hysterically that neither of them could read the castle map, nor recall the correct route to their first class. By the time they scrambled down the winding corridors, it was almost 9 o'clock, and the history of magic class was about to begin. Harry Potter and his friends arrived early to their first history of magic class, filled with eager anticipation. As first-year students, they'd heard endless rumors about Professor Binns, the only ghost to teach at Hogwarts, so they hurried through the corridors on the castle's second floor, books clutched in their arms. "Have you read Hogwarts, A History of the School?" Lisa Dupin asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You'll know that Professor Binns has been teaching here since the very beginning." "Legend says he dozed off one night in the staff lounge," Terry Boot chimed in from Terry Boot, leaning against a dusty tapestry. "There was a fire, but he never even noticed. The next morning, he turned up in class, only to realize he'd left his body behind." Lisa giggled. "He was so old back then, he didn't even realize he died." They peered through the frosted windows of Classroom 2, expecting to see desks laid out in neat rows and perhaps a chalky podium at the front. From tales they'd heard, Binns was strict yet absent-minded, delivering his lectures in an eerie monotone that could lull the most restless student to sleep. Just as the castle's ancient clock began to chime the hour, the double doors swung open soundlessly. A pale, translucent figure drifted into the room, his robes brushing against the stone floor without a whisper. There he hovered, Professor Cuthbert Binns, History of Magic's sole instructor for over 9 centuries. Harry felt a thrill of wonder. The ghost Professor Binns adjusted his pince-nez glasses and cleared his throat, though the sound was little more than a distant echo. "Good morning," he intoned, voice steady and somber. "Today we shall begin with the founding of Hogwarts School and the remarkable achievements of its 4 houses." As the other students filed in behind them, settling into the wooden benches, Harry leaned close to Ron and whispered, "I can't wait to see if he really does put us to sleep." Ron grinned, pulling out a quill. "Just make sure you don't doze off and leave your body behind, like old Binns." And with that, the ghost professor began his first lecture, one destined, it seemed, to become the most soporific class at Hogwarts. Professor Binns was eventually, and quite rightly, installed as the History of Magic professor at Hogwarts. A History of Hogwarts describes his lectures like this. When lunchtime neared, the students would file out of Professor Binns's classroom with genuine reluctance. True, the Animagi demonstrations were dazzling, but it was Binns's methodical account of ancient magical practices and forgotten enchanted dynasties that really stirred their imaginations. Hermione had that very paragraph underlined in her copy. "Fred and George told me this is the perfect class for a nap," she announced proudly one morning in the corridor. "Supposedly, Professor Binns just reads from his own notes without ever looking at us. He can't even remember our names, and he doesn't seem to mind if half the class dozes off." Ron shot her a dubious look. "Sounds like one of their pranks, doesn't it? I can't believe he'd be that boring." But Hermione, who trusted her books above all, simply shook her head. To her, anything printed in a history of Hogwarts was gospel. At precisely 9 o'clock the next day, the corridor door swung open, and the students hurried into the classroom. A hush fell over them as they took their seats in neat rows. Then, as if summoned by their anticipation, a pearly-white, translucent figure drifted silently through the blackboard. Clutching a tattered notebook to its chest, the ghostly professor paused at the front of the room, his hollow eyes scanning the silent, expectant faces before him, and the lesson began. Professor Binns greeted the class in his usual dry monotone and cleared his throat. Today's topic is famous figures in the wizarding world. 2 names that are most often confused are Murick, a particularly malevolent sorcerer, and Uric, a rather eccentric wizard. The moment Binns mentioned those 2 names, Ron realized his brother hadn't been exaggerating about how mind-numbingly dull this lecture could be. But before he could savor that small victory, the professor's droning, toad-like drawl had Ron's eyelids drooping. He fought it for a minute, then surrendered and rested his head on his arms. Peering at his notes through half-closed eyes, Professor Binns continued in that low, unvarying drone, like an ancient vacuum cleaner squeaking along an endless corridor. By the time he finished recounting Urik's eccentricities, every student in the room was teetering on the edge of sleep, waking only long enough to scribble down a name or date before drifting off again. Even Hermione, resolute as ever, found her quill moving in half-hearted loops when her mind wandered. Ron, ever the pragmatist, had the foresight to bring a small pillow, and within seconds of placing it under his head, he was fast asleep. 2 hours slipped away before anyone noticed the hands on the clock had crept well past 11. Hermione sat up with a dramatic sigh. I still can't believe Professor Binns lectures like that. Ron stretched and yawned. Honestly, though, that was the best nap I've had in ages. Harry shook his head, blinking the last vestiges of sleep from his eyes. Well, he's been teaching for an awfully long time. Hogwarts is over 1,000 years old. He might have been here when it first opened its doors. Have you two never noticed just how soporific he is? Professor Binns's lectures were thorough and right to the point. His only real flaws were his habit of droning on about minutiae and his uncanny ability to put students to sleep. Ryan rubbed his temples, looking every bit the eager scholar who just absorbed every word. Then he pulled out his enchanted notebook, into which he'd recorded Binns's entire lecture and had it transcribed automatically, and nudged it toward Hermione. This is unbelievable, Hermione said, flashing a grin. I didn't catch half of this. I've remembered so many things wrong. Mind if I borrow a copy, Ryan? Ron asked eagerly, and Harry nodded in agreement. Frankly, Ryan thought, History of Magic was always scheduled first thing in the morning, almost certainly to fend off the Sandman. The only way to survive was by sheer willpower and meticulous note-taking. Plus, once you had the full transcript, all you really needed to do was circle the key points on your own afterward. There was no need for endless studying. Amid the hum of chattering students, the three friends made their way into the auditorium and settled at a table in the Ravenclaw section. Seamus Finnegan spun around in his seat, glaring at his fellow Gryffindors. Honestly, Professor Quirrell is hopeless, he grumbled, arms crossed. He's so unreliable in defense against the dark arts that I've taken to pinching my nose shut before I even step into his classroom. Trust me, it helps. He gave a dramatic shudder. And garlic, don't even mention it. I used to love the stuff, but lately I can't stand the smell or the taste. Chapter 94. The Conflicted Chi-Luo. Today, please place your order. By 11:30, the tables were heaped with golden platters of food, and the goblets brimmed with frothy drinks. Harry and his friends reached eagerly for the nearest dishes and began to eat. Nearby, Seamus fussed about the morning's defense against the dark arts lesson. Professor Quirrell is hopeless, Seamus complained, spearing a sausage with his fork. He takes forever to get to a point, and that garlic headscarf of his. Ugh, I still feel queasy just smelling it. Harry shrugged. Hagrid told me he was brilliant once, full of knowledge and theory, but he went traveling for a year to gain practical experience. Seamus wrinkled his nose. Practical experience? What does that mean? Harry took a bite of roast beef. Word is, he ran into a vampire in the Forbidden Forest and tangled with an old witch who did him serious harm. After that, he came back a changed man, jumpy around students and terrified of the very subjects he teaches. Seamus's eyes widened. So it's true? The garlic's to keep vampires away? And helping that African prince drive off the resurrected zombies wasn't just hot air? Lavender Brown piped up, tilting her head in curiosity as she joined the conversation. It wasn't, Ron replied, leaning forward. Professor Quirrell was a brilliant student, our Ravenclaw prefect, and the moment he graduated, he stayed on at Hogwarts as the Muggle Studies professor. He taught our year last year and was easily one of the best instructors we had. Things have been odd lately, but I'm sure he'll find his footing again soon. Before anyone else could speak, a handsome, black-haired third-year boy stepped forward with an apologetic smile. Sorry to cut in, he said. I'm Roger Davies, third-year Ravenclaw chaser. He turned to Harry Potter, who was still processing Ron's story. We're holding Quidditch tryouts next week. You're Harry, right? Your dad, James Potter, was Gryffindor's seeker and helped them win the cup. Even though you're only a first year, it'd be great if you'd come out for trials. Harry blinked in surprise, then straightened up and gave a tentative nod. Okay, I'll try. Roger beamed. Fantastic. Honestly, after slogging through History of Magic this morning and defense against the dark arts this afternoon, the best cure is a bit of broomstick work. Padma Patil, who, like Ryan, had been sorted into Ravenclaw, leaned over to the twins at the next table. "So we're expected to do all our studying on our own?" she complained. Parvati Patil beside her merely rolled her eyes. Ryan noticed then how few first years Ravenclaw had this year. In the original timeline, he wasn't even supposed to attend Hogwarts. That meant that, aside from Harry, Ron, Neville, Hermione, and himself, every Ravenclaw in this year's intake was a student from the canonical books. Among the familiar faces were Anthony Goldstein, Lisa Dupin, Michael Corner, Padma Patil, Terry Boot, about 6 in all. The rest, Kevin Entwistle, Mandy Block, Morag McDougall, Stephen Cornford, and Sue Lai, were the 5 background students who'd never warranted more than a passing mention. In total, there were only 16 new Ravenclaws. Unconsciously, Ryan began cataloging these classmates in his mind. Michael Corner, for example, was described in the books as a dark-skinned boy, the dark-skinned boy Hermione once called him. But in the film adaptation, he'd been cast as a long-haired youth with bright red lips and gleaming white teeth. Each of these details felt oddly significant, as if preparing him for the challenges yet to come. Among the members of Dumbledore's army that Harry now walked alongside were Nye, who was dating Chu Zhang, Anthony Goldstein, the Jewish prefect of Ravenclaw in 5th year, Padma Patil, another Ravenclaw prefect from India whom Harry quietly admired, and Terry Boot. All of them had fought bravely to defend Hogwarts in Harry's 7th year. By the time the meal ended, Ryan found himself trailing after Harry and company as they made their way back to the common R. With nothing better to do, he plopped into an armchair and flipped through a book he'd casually picked up, Basic Magic Spells for Busy and Irritated People. The title alone made him smile, though he'd only skimmed its pages so far. Ryan glanced at his watch. Afternoon classes awaited. Defense against the dark arts from 1 to 3, followed by herbology from 3:30 to 5:30. In his previous life, herbology had felt more like a lively exercise session than a proper academic subject, digging in the soil, repotting mandrakes, chasing runaway devil's snare. But today it was scheduled so late that he couldn't help feeling a twinge of regret. With this afternoon's lesson behind him, only one more herbology class remained this week, Thursday morning. He pushed the book aside and sighed. Well, at least there was still that to look forward to. Ryan couldn't help but worry that Neville might rediscover his old passion for herbology, perhaps even go on to teach the subject himself one day, just as in the original timeline. In this Hogwarts, Gryffindor's herbology lessons were shared with Hufflepuff, which must have been how Neville and Hannah first met. After all, Neville had always shone in herbology, whereas he never quite managed to master flying lessons or potions. Now both merged into Hufflepuff classes. It seemed almost scripted, Neville bonding over mandrakes and fanged geraniums with Hannah, setting them on a path toward each other. He certainly wouldn't end up alone. The short break was over all too quickly. At precisely 12:30, the first-year Ravenclaws drifted up to the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom on the 3rd floor. Ryan braced himself. By the time the door creaked open, he already knew disaster was coming. Their new professor hobbled in, turban slightly askew, a faint whiff of garlic trailing behind him. Clearing his throat 2 or 3 times, he managed a shaky bow. "Good afternoon, everyone. Heir, I'm Professor Quirinus Quirrell, and I'll be your Defense Against the Dark Arts instructor." He paused, cast a sidelong glance at Harry, and forced a nervous chuckle. "Although, Mr. Potter, I dare say you hardly need lessons in this subject, A ripple of stifled giggles swept the room. Quirrell's stiff smile wavered. He shuffled to the front, hands clasped so tightly at his chest that his knuckles turned white. Ryan sighed and flipped open his copy of Dark Power, A Guide to Self-Defense by Quentin Trimble. If this was what counted as teaching, they were going to need every tip and trick Trimble could offer, garlic breath included. Hermione had insisted on sitting in the front row, despite the choking fumes that curled through the classroom. She rolled her eyes at the smoke, but stubbornly continued taking notes. Harry, meanwhile, was cringing so badly his face practically scrunched into a ball. He fought every instinct telling him to cover his nose. Ron fared no better. He held a sheet of parchment over his face as though it might filter out the stench. Professor Quirrell, for his part, acted as if none of it concerned him. Across the room, Ryan watched them all with narrowed eyes. He couldn't shake the suspicion that Quirrell was deliberately filling the chamber with foul air just to torture Harry. Thankfully, Ryan's mastery of his level 5 body transformation meant he no longer needed to breathe. Otherwise, he admitted to himself, he'd have leaped to his feet and ripped Quirrell apart on the spot. Then Ryan remembered something that stung more than any smoke. Earlier today, Quirrell had embarrassed him in front of Kate by insisting the shambling zombies roaming the castle grounds were some exotic menace imported from Africa. And how had Quirrell known this? By waving around that garish scarf of his, claiming it had once belonged to an African prince, apparently the perfect talisman against the undead. Ryan rolled his eyes. Of course he'd forgotten that ridiculous story. Quirrell never let anyone else forget it. A clever idea began to form in Ryan's mind. After all, Quirrell was nothing if not conceited. The pompous Ravenclaw had once fancied himself capable of bending even the weak Dark Lord to his will single-handedly. Tonight, Ryan decided, he'd give the professor a little taste of his own arrogance. After his preliminary inquiries led nowhere, Professor Quirrell ventured alone into Albania's Black Forest. Deep among the ancient pines, he suddenly collapsed on the forest floor, only to awaken moments later bound and subdued by Lord Voldemort himself. From that instant on, he became the Dark Lord's unwitting servant. Desperate to alert Albus Dumbledore to his plight, Quirrell resorted to all manner of subtle signals. He stumbled through Defense Against the Dark Arts classes, botched simple spells, and even smeared himself with garlic in hopes of driving away the parasite clinging to his neck. Yet every hint he offered was met with Dumbledore's serene indifference. Quirrell agonized over it. How could the greatest wizard of their age fail to notice the foul stench of possession? Would a whiff of garlic truly mask the very essence of Voldemort's corruption? His despair only deepened upon encountering Harry Potter in Diagon Alley. Quirrell had half hoped the boy who lived might unleash some miraculous power to expel Voldemort from his body. Instead, the meeting proved nothing more than a painful reminder of his own helplessness. Bound ever tighter to the Dark Lord, Quirrell found himself compelled to accompany Voldemort even into the treacherous depths of Gringotts. He risked everything, his freedom, his reputation, even his life, and had they not aided his escape, he would never have made it out alive. Yet amid the terror, a curious fascination took root. Through their enforced union, Voldemort began imparting ancient, profound secrets to Quirrell. Night after night, as the Dark Lord whispered forgotten lore into his ear, Quirrell felt his mind expand. A dangerous ambition awakened within him. If this bond endured, and if Voldemort ever returned to full power, Quirrell realized he might stand second to none in the Dark Lord's new order. Chapter 95. Chi-Luo Faints. Professor Quirrell stood at the front of the empty classroom, lecturing with unsteady words. His mind was miles away from the lesson. The theories on spell harmonics droned through his lips by rote, while his thoughts drifted to a far darker subject. According to the Dark Lord, Harry Potter was nothing more than a fortuitous child, saved by his mother's sacrificial charm. Quirrell had readily agreed, yet a persistent doubt nagged at him. He knew better than anyone how close he'd come to losing himself entirely when he allowed Voldemort to inhabit his body. His masterful occlumency had kept the Dark Lord's mind reading at bay, preserved his own life, and hidden his true thoughts from Dumbledore and the rest of the wizarding world. Voldemort, fooled by Quirrell's apparent cowardice, assumed Quirrell was nothing but a timid, fragile vessel. But recently, an odd phenomenon had unsettled Quirrell's carefully guarded facade. Even Peeves the Poltergeist, the school's most mischievous and unpredictable spirit, shrunk from Harry, refusing to get within half a step of the boy. That refusal hinted at something far more potent than simple luck or protection charms. Quirrell paused mid-sentence, his quill hovering over the parchment. If Peeves feared Harry, perhaps the boy's power ran deeper than any prophecy. With that unsettling realization burning in his mind, Quirrell decided it was time to test Harry's true strength, right here, in his own classroom. He drew a steadying breath. The next spell he cast would reveal everything. Professor Quirrell cleared his throat and addressed the class. All right, everyone, are you all clear on how to produce the red sparks we covered? He paused, swallowing. Let me say it once more. The incantation is periculum. Always point your wand at the sky as you speak it. It creates a bright red flare, a simple emergency signal you can use if you ever find yourself in trouble outdoors. Any nearby wizards will see it and come to your aid. Quirrell glanced nervously at Harry. Mr. Potter, would you demonstrate for us? Harry stepped forward, wand at the ready. He lifted his arm and aimed at the vaulted ceiling. Periculum, he called out. Instantly, a vivid crimson beam shot from his wand tip. It blossomed midair into a cascade of sparkling fireworks, each burst crackling like a handful of miniature suns. For a moment, the entire classroom was bathed in red light, and every eye was fixed on those beautiful, dancing sparks. Then came the unexpected twist. A sudden flare veered downward and struck Professor Quirrell directly. He let out a high-pitched cry and collapsed at Harry's feet, desperately clutching his robes as the sparks singed his skin. Where they touched, his flesh reddened and swelled instantly. He could no longer stammer. His wand fell from his shaking hand, and he fainted in pain. Scattered sparks peppered the front row, Hermione, Ron, and the neighboring students. Yet, instead of agony, they felt an odd sense of relief, as if a weight had lifted from their minds. A fresh, sweet scent, like grass after rain, filled the air. Harry stared down at the fallen professor, his heart pounding. What just happened? He whispered, utterly bewildered. Harry lowered his wand and looked around the table. See? I did it! Ron sprang to his feet, admiration shining in his eyes. How did Professor Quirrell manage that? It feels incredible. Hermione, who'd been doused in the residual spray, stared at Harry in bewilderment, her front teeth bared in a puzzled frown. Neville inhaled deeply and let out a relieved sigh. I feel alive. Have you all noticed how much fresher the air is? Absolutely. Neville agreed, closing his eyes to savor the clean scent. Padma Patil smiled, for the first time in what felt like ages. Harry, what spell was that? How does it banish the odor so thoroughly? Completely absorbed by the moment, Hermione failed to notice Professor Quirrell slumped beside her on the front bench. For the next few minutes, the Ravenclaw table buzzed with excitement and speculation about this mysterious air-purifying magic. Could Professor Quirrell have been cursed? Hermione wondered aloud. Maybe whatever Harry just did has purifying properties, properties that caused Quirrell so much pain. Oof! Professor Quirrell! Ron suddenly shouted. From the podium came a muffled groan, but it wasn't enough to rouse the professor. What's happened to him? Hermione exclaimed, pressing her fingers to her forehead. Don't distract me, Ron. I'm trying to remember. She fell silent, brow furrowed. No, something's missing. What am I forgetting? Stench? Smell? Garlic? Professor Quirrell? Ron muttered, as if jabbing at his own temples might jog Hermione's memory. The room fell quiet. Harry exchanged a look with Hermione and Ron, realizing that they'd uncovered a powerful new charm, yet still lacked the crucial piece of understanding that would explain just how it worked. Hermione's eyes shot to the front of the classroom. Professor Quirrell's back at the podium. Harry blinked, then leapt to his feet. I'll go fetch Madame Pomfrey. I completely forgot about her. Count me in, called Michael, his dark skin gleaming under the floating candles. Which floor is the hospital wing on? Harry hesitated for a moment, then smiled. Senior Pinello sent me a map earlier, and I made a note. Madame Pomfrey's office is at the end of the second-floor corridor. Anthony Goldstein, always quick to think on his feet and decisive enough to have earned his prefect badge, clapped his hands. Michael, Terry, let's carry Professor Quirrell up there right away. Michael knelt beside the motionless professor and shook his head. No, Mr. Goldstein. It looks like the vampire's curse has flared up again. Quirrell needs rest in the staff lounge. At that instant, Professor Quirrell's eyes snapped open. He bolted upright, his face flushed and twitching. Mr. Potter, 5 points from Ravenclaw for leaving class early. Class is dismissed. With surprising agility, he hopped off the dais and hobbled toward the first-floor lounge under his own power. Ron stared after him, slack-jawed. Harry, I think Professor Quirrell's gone completely mad. Harry gave a slow nod, uncertainty twisting in his chest. Harry's curse had purified Professor Quirrell's dark enchantment. Hermione, standing a few paces away, lifted her head thoughtfully. Harry, Your curse. It cleansed Quirrell's curse. Ryan, hidden in the shadows, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He said nothing, content to let Harry take all the credit. From Harry's perspective, he alone had wrought this miracle. As he poured his magic into the spell, a strange new power surged through him. Nothing like the faint thrill he would later feel when summoning red sparks. In truth, three forces had converged in that instant. First was the power of love. Lily Evans had sacrificed herself to leave behind, a protective magic woven into her son's very blood. Second was the frantic pulse of Voldemort's fragmented soul, sensing its master's presence and crying out to be whole again. And third was Harry's own nascent magical talent, raw and untested, rising to meet the moment's need. The effect was instantaneous. The foul garlic smell clinging to Quirrell vanished, as if wiped away by a gust of fresh air. Even the acrid smoke that had stung Harry's lungs dispersed, leaving the room astonishingly clear. For a heartbeat, all was still. Then Quirrell crumpled, stripped of the dark curse that had held him captive. Hermione and Harry exchanged a look of stunned relief. The air around them seemed to hum with the echoes of that combined magic, a testament to the power of love and to the unexpected depths of Harry's own courage. Even if Dumbledore learned what happened, he'd be certain it was Quirrell's own malice that triggered Harry's protective magic. When he arrived and examined the lingering traces of spellwork, he would only detect those three distinct sources of power, and Ryan, whose presence is barely perceptible, would slip by entirely unnoticed. What's more, once Quirrell was attacked, the fragment of Voldemort housed inside him would fall into a temporary slumber. In that window of vulnerability, Quirrell could pour out the truth to Dumbledore, plead for mercy, and finally, just perhaps, shake off Voldemort's domination. Annoying as Quirrell could be, Ryan still believes he's worth saving. In the original timeline, Quirrell nearly let Voldemort's spirit loose on the Hogwarts Quidditch pitch. He kept that darkness teetering just out of sight, using it to jinx Harry's broom and force him tumbling from the sky, not to kill him outright, but to expose his own hidden alliance. In truth, he was nothing more than a coward, his ambition masked by a sliver of conscience. Tragically, he never had the chance to see his confession through. The long-rumored curse on the Defense Against the Dark Arts professorship claimed his life by sheer mischance. Once Voldemort laid claim to him, there was no turning back. He could rely on no one but himself. Even Dumbledore, ever generous with second chances, never stepped forward to offer him one. Chapter 96. Quirrell's Choice. Today, please order. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Professor Quirrell's Defense Against the Dark Arts class still had 30 minutes to go, and herbology wouldn't begin for another hour, ample time for Harry and his friends. They drifted back to the common room together, chattering over everything that had happened in class. Yet Ryan let out a silent sigh as he walked. Quirrell still hadn't seized the final opportunity. On the surface, Ryan's prank had looked like a spur-of-the-moment stunt, but he'd meticulously considered every angle before setting it in motion. He'd weighed the risk of being caught and plotted ways to cover his tracks. More important, he'd orchestrated it so that Quirrell would still have a clear path to Dumbledore, choosing a moment when the headmaster was definitely on campus, in the library on the 4th floor, rather than out on some errand. Even the students Quirrell ran into along the way had been quietly steered by Ryan's subtle manipulations, each one accidentally pointing him to the right destination. That careful planning explained why Quirrell had only lost consciousness briefly, just 10 minutes, enough to rattle him, but not to thwart Ryan's real goal, giving Quirrell one last chance. When Harry came to, he realized that at Dumbledore's usual slow pace, they'd only just made it to the 4th floor, just as Professor Quirrell drew near. Oddly enough, though Quirrell had caught wind of Dumbledore's whereabouts, he'd paused briefly on that landing and then turned back down toward the 1st floor, ignoring the route that Ryan had laid out for him. Honestly, Gryffindor really is the best, Ron grumbled as they walked toward the greenhouse. Nearly headless Nick is always showing lost first years the way. Meanwhile, Miss Gray snubs everyone all day. Harry managed a weak smile, but felt a knot of worry tighten in his chest. Ron, do you think I'm going to keep losing control of my magic like this? Even Peeves won't go near me now. Ron waved him off. Don't sweat it. It's just Quirrell's doing. If it weren't for you, we'd probably be suffocating right now. Neville's round face bobbed up between them, or stuck smelling like garlic, just like Seamus after his defense against the dark arts class this afternoon. At that moment, Hermione huffed and interjected. Harry, I think your pronunciation needs work. When you say periculum, the M must be sharp, and the first syllable quick. Harry took a deep breath, nodded at his friends, and prepared to try the incantation again. Since arriving in Ravenclaw, Hermione had truly thrived. Her habit of diving into textbook minutiae and sharing every newly discovered fact fit perfectly with the house's love of learning. Ron and Harry, impressed by her brilliance from the start, now welcomed Hermione's sidebar lectures as helpful reminders. In their new house, the trio felt like pampered debutantes. Outside of class, they rarely left the common room and, remarkably, stayed out of trouble, much to Hermione's delight, as it gave her ample opportunity to lecture. Even Professor Snape's long-held irritation with Harry seemed to soften. The sour looks and clipped remarks had all but disappeared. Harry's transformation was plain to see. He'd shed every trace of his boisterous father's swagger. No more midnight escapades, no more headlong risks that gave the staff gray hairs. Instead, he spent his days reading quietly by the smoky blue fireplace. If this calm, studious life honored Lily's sacrifice, well, it was one Harry was more than happy to embrace. Reflecting on it, Snape's old disdain had made sense for two reasons. First, Harry's fame on the Quidditch pitch, his hunger for the spotlight and daredevil antics, left the potions master worried and resentful. And second, Harry's abysmal potions grades and shaky academic record gave Snape little reason to show him any kindness. Now, with Harry settled and studious in Ravenclaw, even Snape seemed willing to give him a fresh start. Harry had none of Lily's gentler gifts, none of her warm, none of her quick wit. Instead, every time he stared into a mirror, he saw only James Potter's face. The unruly black hair, the straight nose, and that familiar lightning bolt scar etched on his forehead. Oddly enough, it was Lily's presence that clung to his closest friends. Ron's hair still blazed vivid red, just as Lily's had, and Hermione's mind was every bit as sharp. Even Harry himself bore his mother's emerald green eyes. Surrounded by these echoes of Lily, Severus Snape found it impossible to separate Harry from the son of the man he loathed. And yet, beneath the surface, a truce nearly formed. One couldn't help but suspect that Albus Dumbledore quietly engineered the chance for them to understand each other. At the end of Harry's first year, when the boy finally realized Snape wasn't the villain he had imagined, he let slip a private theory. You only protect me because James once saved your life. Snape's reply shattered their fragile peace. He hated James Potter, loathed him, but loved Lily more than anything. It was Lily's memory, not debt to James, that drove him to keep Harry safe. Harry recoiled, convinced Snape was sullying his father's name. Their rapprochement dissolved overnight, leaving them as bitterly divided as before. It was not until Harry's 5th year that Snape extended an olive branch, occlumency lessons. Day after day, Snape guided Harry into the hidden chambers of his own mind, teaching him to shield his thoughts, and in turn, showing him memories he had never known. Through that shared window into the past, Harry gleaned a truer picture of James Potter, one that neither hero worship nor spite could fully define. Earlier, Dumbledore had asked Snape to be the one to kill him, and the weight of that request drove a wedge between them, turning any residual trust into icy indifference, even outright hatred. Yet in a strange way, those very extremes prepared Harry to finally steady himself and heed Snape's dying words. According to Dumbledore's plan, Snape never needed to die. If he'd simply revealed the full truth to Harry and handed him the sword of Gryffindor as instructed, then stayed on to protect Hogwarts, he could have played his part, escaped detection, and lived. Instead, Snape volunteered to deliver the killing blow to Nagini himself, a decision born of proud self-reliance that ultimately led to his downfall. In that moment of arrogance, he sealed his fate. Perhaps it's no accident that Slytherins with even a shred of conscience tend to be the most overconfident. Take Draco Malfoy, for instance, so adept at smothering any flicker of compassion that he revels in tormenting others. Across the courtyard, Malfoy was striding toward Harry now, the familiar contempt in his stance. He didn't look like he came in peace. This time, though, he'd learned to keep his voice low. Professor Sprout was nearby. He leaned in just enough for Harry to hear. "Potter," Malfoy drawled, "I hear you're in trouble again. What did you do this time?" Harry's heart pounded as he watched the exchange, silently thinking, "You seem to be in trouble. I'm worried about you." "This has nothing to do with you, Malfoy," Ron snapped under his breath. Draco raised an elegant eyebrow, feigning concern. "Oh, are you going to curse me, Weasley? I'm so frightened." He glanced at Harry and added in a softer tone, "You really broke my heart, Potter." Ron gritted his teeth. "Shut up, Malfoy." Professor Sprout, kneeling by a row of potted mandrakes, looked up from her spade. "Mr. Weasley, any questions about loosening the soil?" Ron's face went scarlet. "No, Professor," he mumbled, refusing to take his glare off Draco. Malfoy couldn't contain his laughter. He clapped a hand over his mouth and shook with mirth, elbowing Goyle and Crabbe as though sharing a private joke. Before long, the clock chimed 4, signaling the end of herbology. "Time for a break," Professor Sprout announced, wiping her brow. As the other students filed out, Ron strode toward Draco, fury burning in his eyes. "Malfoy, you're a nasty piece of work. Why do you insist on tormenting Harry?" Draco leaned back, hands in his pockets, and adopted a languid, drawling tone. "What? Am I tormenting him? If you're so convinced, perhaps you should speak up, Weasley." Ron's knuckles whitened around his wand. "If you've got nothing to say, then keep your mouth shut." Malfoy gave a light, contemptuous laugh. "Honestly, I'd love to know how someone like you landed in Ravenclaw. The Sorting Hat must have felt sorry for poor Harry's lackey." He paused, tossing his blonde hair. "Let's face it, one Weasley is better than 10 of you." With that, he sauntered off, leaving Ron fuming and Harry glancing between them, more determined than ever to stand by his friend. "I think I know who might be better suited for my friend," Harry said coolly. Malfoy's mocking grin slipped away. He shot Harry a sharp look, then, wordlessly, melted back into the Slytherin ranks. Hermione leaned in toward Ron. "See what I mean? Malfoy's just trying to get under your skin. Keep your guard up, and hey, at least Professor Sprout didn't take any points off." Ron stared, surprised. He'd expected Hermione to scold him about house points, especially after everything that's happened. But since they'd started mingling with Ravenclaw, she'd seemed oddly unconcerned about the scoreboard. Chapter 24, Chapter 97. Fornhem. Outside the Hogwarts greenhouse, Hermione had just finished her short lecture, and Ron, composed once more, was busily recounting all the Malfoy family's dirty secrets and so-called great achievements to Harry. "Hedwig? Hungry again?" Harry murmured, rummaging for toast crumbs in his pocket. Hedwig usually didn't deliver messages. Instead, she'd flutter over now and then, peck at his ear for a bite of toast, then return to the owlery to nap with the others. No wonder she was so plump. But today was different. Hedwig accepted the crumbs without protest, settled on Harry's left shoulder, and then lifted her right leg insistently. Curious, Harry peered at her talon and discovered a note, its handwriting a messy scrawl. "Dear Harry, I know you don't have classes Friday afternoon. I wasn't expecting you in Ravenclaw, but could you come by for tea around 3? I'd love to hear how your first week's gone. Please send your reply with Hedwig." Hagrid Harry pulled out a quill, hastily scribbled on the back of the note, "Yes, I'd love to. See you soon." He tied it securely to Hedwig's leg. "Off you go," he said, watching her take flight toward Hagrid's hut. Thankfully, Harry still had tea with Hagrid to look forward to. Yet for the next hour, time inched by as if each minute were an entire day. Nearby, Draco Malfoy, stung by Harry's firm refusal, kept sidling over to murmur bizarre taunts. As soon as class let out, Harry and Ron practically spitting with anger, made to chase after him, but Malfoy slipped away into the milling crowd before they could catch up. "Malfoy's such a sneak," Harry grumbled. "How did he vanish so fast?" Ron frowned, glancing at Harry. "Maybe he's cowed by that display you pulled in Defense Against the Dark Arts." He sounded half convinced, half dismissive. At the reminder of the duel, especially how it had ended with Quirrell's tumble, Harry winced. His kind heart ached with guilt over the professor's injury. Unseen, Ryan watched the exchange with keen interest. He was fascinated by the residual love charm woven into Harry's bloodline, an enchantment sprouted by Lily Evans's sacrifice. Every flutter of Harry's emotions set that dormant magic to stirring beneath his skin. The trouble was, none of Lily's other relatives were magical, so her spell had lain inactive ever since Harry left the Dursley household. That left Ryan, who fed on living magic, weak and weary, craving that daily feast of emotion he could no longer harvest. Suddenly, thought struck him. Dudley Dursley was Harry's cousin, after all. A wizard might not be able to turn a muggle into a magician, but that didn't mean Ryan lacked options. Knockturn Alley was overflowing with raw materials, Ryan thought, and he couldn't stay still. In a blink, the Phoenix incarnation dissolved, and he reappeared in human form on Diagon Alley, no one the wiser. Despite the transformation, Ryan's mind remained perfectly his own, tethered to his other self by a mysterious divine link. With classes finally over for the day, he slipped away alone toward the Hogwarts dormitories. Jason Custer was a dark wizard under the sway of the formidable Mr. Borgin. After Borgin struck it rich thanks to Doraemon, he abandoned his old lowly life and began popping into his shop on Diagon Alley to oversee the business himself. That didn't mean he was a kindly employer, though. Remember the Slytherin Student Union president who once served under him? Word had it that this talented predecessor could coax even the most stubborn witch or wizard into consigning their prized heirlooms for sale. But when the celebrated Puziba Smith met her untimely end, that enterprising president resigned, and the legendary Hufflepuff Gold Cup vanished without a trace. The legendary treasure was meant to serve as a bargaining chip. Senior's task was simply to persuade Puziba Smith to part with it. But somehow the plan went awry, and to everyone's surprise, Mr. Borgin never reported the fiasco. He buried it instead. In the aftermath, an elderly house elf named Hermione, though Jason Custer always misremembered her name as Hao Chi, stepped forward to take the fall. She claimed that in her dotage, she had accidentally spiked the hostess's evening cocoa with poison. Case closed, or so they thought. In reality, Jason Custer was the true architect of the affair. On paper, he had nothing remarkable about him. A spotless background, no criminal record, an unassuming disposition. In private, however, he was brilliant, methodical, and extraordinarily ruthless. Every so often, he would select a handsome young Muggle man, engineer his disappearance, and callously murder him to vent some hidden rage. When he grew tired of simply killing, he repurposed their remains into twisted, cursed trinkets, a grim testament to his creativity. Custer never feared discovery. He preferred victims who loved remote wilderness, hikers, climbers, travelers off the beaten path, both for their toughness, ideal for elaborate games, and because their vanishings drew little notice. Once he'd finished with a body, he'd leave the scraps in dragon-infested wilds, where the beast's own meals and discarded limbs hid the evidence. Lately, though, Jason's grisly hobby has been on hold. He's immersed himself in a new obsession, so completely that several of his usual companions have, to everyone's alarm, simply disappeared. No trace of them remains, and each passing day only deepens the mystery. Jason had always known the life of a high-profile wizard carried a certain danger. Feuds ran deep in their world, and anyone with blood of more than one famous witch or wizard on their hands was bound to make enemies. But he'd never imagined it would happen to him. He pressed his wand against his inner forearm, a reflex from his days prowling Knockturn Alley, where instant access to your wand could mean the difference between life and death. Then, in an instant, the damp cobblestones and gaslit storefronts disappeared. A strange, tingling sensation told him he'd slipped through some invisible barrier. Jason's eyes snapped open. This wasn't Knockturn Alley. He was surrounded by towering trees, their branches swaying in a whispering wind. A deep, resonant roar rolled through the forest, rattling the underbrush. Dragons. Welsh green dragons, the most common wild breed in Britain, but still terrifying. He wiped sweat from his forehead. An adult Welsh green could grow nearly 18 feet long, its claws capable of ripping a man in two, and he'd left his dragon-repellent perfume back in his room. Panic crept in. He took a careful breath, found a patch of sunlight filtering through the canopy, and edged backward as silently as possible. Then, crack! A snapped twig echoed at his heels. Jason froze, every nerve on fire. He slowly turned his head. There, half buried in moss and dead leaves, lay a bleached fragment of bone. His heart thudded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He knelt, picked it up, and swallowed the lump in his throat. This is a muggle's, he whispered, voice trembling. My favorite. Jason pressed the bone to his lips, intent on one more savage bite. If it hadn't been broken, I would have. His words died in his throat as a bitter, metallic taste spread across his tongue. He staggered back. No, how can this be? It burns. Please, spare me. I'm Mr. Borgen's man. Help! His eyes locked on the shattered fragment at his feet. Before he could cry out again, his knees buckled. He fell forward, face toward the bone, his body racked with tremors and unending pleas for mercy. 10 minutes later, consumed by an unseen terror, Jason lay still. A cold voice broke the silence. You never realized, did you, that the agony you endured was the very same your victim felt in their dying moments? From the shadows stepped a figure, Ryan, his expression one of mournful disappointment. He shook his head and sighed. Why not repent for the innocent life you took? Confession might ease your conscience. You're the 51st soul to face this reckoning. If you don't find redemption soon, you'll be back on the list. Perhaps next month or after your next crime. With that, Ryan's form drifted away, vanishing like a ghost into the gathering gloom. Chapter 98. The Birth of Wizard Dudley Dursley. It was nearly 6 o'clock as dusk settled over the abandoned forest. Ryan knelt beside the motionless body and began to chant a low, resonant spell. With each syllable, the corpse convulsed, exhaling a swirl of inky darkness. From its chest, a pulsating black sphere materialized and hovered between earth and sky. At Ryan's whispered command, a narrow portal shimmered into existence, and the orb slipped through, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. All along, Ryan had been monitoring Bogenbach's smuggling ring in Nocturne Alley, deliberately holding back. Bogenbach himself wasn't irredeemably evil, and by leaving him untouched, Ryan drew in a stream of far more unsavory characters. Though their heavy workloads left them little time for overt cruelty, these desperados, ranging from swindlers to loan sharks, provided ample opportunity for Ryan's interventions. After his last sting, only a handful of financial fraudsters remained to plague the alley. Small-time wizards like these posed no real threat, and frankly, they were ministry employees anyway, the very mages Ludo Bagman had rounded up during his high-stakes gambling bust. But tonight, on a sudden impulse, Ryan decided to seize the moment. In the precious hours after his classroom duties, he would strike once more, this time using Jason's latent darkness as the linchpin for a ritual of unparalleled ambition. Thus, by siphoning the foul energies Jason had unwittingly harbored, Ryan set the stage for a more fitting heir to magical power. When the final incantation fell silent, a new wizard emerged from the shadows. Dudley Dursley was reborn, his fate forever entwined with the arcane forces Ryan had so meticulously unleashed. Ryan arrived in Diagon Alley before anyone else. He paused at the twin gateways, one arching into Diagon Alley's bustling shops, the other into the shadowed lanes of Nocturne Alley, and quietly unleashed the teleportation enchantment he'd picked up from an aquatic wizard. Without that timely help, he knew he'd still be studying the spell himself, adding months to his plans. His quarry was Proudface, the so-called Destroyer of Worlds, better known in another guise as Kamen Rider Decade. The moment Jason, Proudface's true name, crossed the threshold, the shimmering dimensional wall activated. He vanished and reappeared in the old refuse-strewn lot behind town, exactly where Ryan normally stashed bodies he wanted out of sight. Waiting there was a muggle skeleton, bound by a grim curse. It would eternally echo every ounce of pain Jason endured. As long as Jason lived, each stab of agony would replay through the brittle bones, a merciless reminder of his trespass. With his target secured, Ryan collected the final ingredients he'd been hunting: fragments of the shattered wards, drops of dragon's blood, and the last echo of the curse's energy. These potent materials were enough to grant Dudley Dursley his long-overdue spark of magic. Against all odds, Dudley would become a wizard. It was a feat no one believed possible. Save for the countless volunteers, witches, wizards, even a few magical creatures, who had poured their power into Ryan's cause. In truth, Ryan already possessed the gift to guide events along any path he chose, yet he remained haunted by a deeper ambition, to create a wizard from nothing. True wizardry, he understood, was more than the right incantations or rare ingredients. It was the power to bend reality itself, a divine prerogative. If he ever hoped to claim that level of mastery, he mused, it might not come until the year of the monkey, or perhaps only beyond that. Some time ago, Ryan chose a perilous shortcut to forge a new wizard. He captured a talented magician, sacrificed him in a dark ritual, and transplanted his magical essence into the body of an ordinary muggle. The result was a fresh-faced wizard whose powers, though diminished and unstable, were sufficient for Ryan's purposes. His ultimate goal was to rekindle the protective enchantment on Harry Potter, and spell keyed to the blow, odd of Lily Evans's kin, so he could abandon the painstaking task of watching over the boy who lived himself. With this surrogate in place, Ryan would let the magic of Lily's lineage do the work. Time passed. Number 4, Privet Drive. Early afternoon sunlight glinted off the perfect hedges and freshly brushed lawns. On the sidewalk, Dudley Dursley stood brandishing his crooked school cane like a conquering general. Even though classes had ended hours ago, he refused to shed his smelting middle school uniform, a brown-red tailcoat matched with orange knickerbockers and a stiff straw boater perched atop his blonde helmet-like hair. Around him clustered his usual cronies, rat-faced Pierre, lanky Danny, squat Moken, pudgy Gordon, and a handful of others. Every day since Dudley began at smelting, they'd congregated here, eager to enact their favorite pastime, hunting down Harry Potter somewhere on the estate. But with summer break underway and no Harry in sight, their games had grown stale. "Dudley, I'm bored," Pierre complained, his nose wrinkling into an even more rat-like sneer. "When's that Potter brat coming back?" Dudley swung his cane again, the crack of wood on pavement punctuating the question. He scowled, as if the universe had personally conspired to deprive him of his sport. "I don't know," Dudley grumbled, shifting his weight from one bloated leg to the other. "But when he does, I want him ready." He paused, eyes glinting. He'll regret ever setting foot here. The others nodded, though none dared suggest a more imaginative pastime. Privet Drive might have been the epitome of dull suburbia, but in their minds, every mysterious absence only heightened the thrill of the chase. And somewhere, just beyond the neatly trimmed hedges, forces were already stirring to ensure that Harry Potter's return would be far more eventful than Dudley Dursley, or anyone else on Privet Drive, could possibly imagine. One afternoon, Uncle Vernon hollered from the living room, "Harry's been sent off to St. Bruce's Security Center for young offenders. He won't be back until summer vacation." The moment Dudley heard Harry's name, he shot up from his chair and rattled the news to his friends. "All right, then," Peter said with a grin. "Let's go over to Mrs. Figg's and see if we can climb her old cherry tree." Danny, Moken, and Gordon all gave eager nods. Dudley glanced back at the kitchen window, where his mother, Petunia Dursley, leaned out to watch them. She spent half her life perched there, spying on their law-abiding neighbors. The boys tumbled through Mrs. Figg's gate into her overgrown yard. As Dudley waved at his mother, Peter called out, "You know, it's odd, Mrs. Strutt. Figg says Harry sometimes vanishes when we chase him, then pops up in that tree as if he's been there all along." Dudley rolled his eyes. "Great, he's gone full cat burglar on us." Peter just beamed. "See? He's basically mastered tree climbing." "Yeah," Dudley muttered, not really listening. He grabbed a sturdy-looking branch and hauled himself up, only to hear a low, ominous creak. He'd forgotten one thing. Since last year, he'd put on enough weight that even thick branches groaned under him. With a crack like thunder, the branch snapped in two. Dudley yelped as he plunged toward the ground. The other boys scattered, shrieking, while Mrs. Figg burst out her front door, her face pale with alarm. Dudley landed in a tangle of twigs and leaves, staring up at the empty gap in the tree above. As he lay there, dusting himself off, he couldn't help but wonder how Harry would have managed, if he'd even bothered to climb at all. In the original timeline, Dudley nearly broke his neck in that fall, but Harry never knew about it. Vernon and Petunia were adamant that no one mentioned the accident, so friends and family alike kept the secret. That's why the incident never showed up in Harry's memories. The scare should have been Dudley's wake-up call about his weight, but at first, he simply gave up. It wasn't until Harry's third year at Hogwarts that the Dursleys finally forced Dudley onto a strict diet. Still, old habits die hard. One evening, driven by a craving he couldn't resist, Dudley downed a thick slice of goose-fat tongue, left behind as a prank by the Weasley twins, and fell deathly ill. That close brush with death jolted him awake. From that day on, Dudley committed himself to discipline. He traded midnight feasts for treadmill sprints, lazy afternoons for boxing drills. By the time Harry came home after his 4th year, Dudley had transformed completely. No longer the chubby bully, he'd slimmed down, grown strong, and even clinched the Southeastern Youth Heavyweight Inter-School Boxing Championship. There was one more detail the original story never mentioned. As he watched Dudley teeter on that old tree branch, just moments before the accident, Harry realized why he'd needed to lift certain restrictions on his cousin. He'd been protecting Dudley in a way no one had ever admitted. Ryan hovered above the Dursleys' backyard, lips curled in satisfaction. His plan had been simple: stage a series of mishaps to mimic a magical explosion, draw in Ministry investigators, and, most deliciously, catch an unsuspecting 11-year-old wizard in the aftermath. He'd even pictured Dudley Dursley rocketing skyward, a spectacular finale. "What a shame," Ryan murmured to himself. "I'd hoped Dudley would detonate and spiral off into the clouds." Below him, Dudley teetered atop a gnarled old tree, petrified. Around the yard, Pierre, Danny, Morkan, and Gordon, Ministry operatives all, stood wide-eyed, gaping at the scene. With a collective gasp, they watched Dudley slip. In an instant, gravity won. But to everyone's astonishment, Dudley's rear end seemed to have a spring of its own. He bounced once, twice, 3 times before hurtling forward. He smashed through the sloping roof of number 4 Privet Drive, punching a hole in the tiles and crashing straight into the hallway. Aunt Petunia, who'd been hovering in the doorway, let out a strangled squeal. Her eyes bulged at the sight of Dudley rolling to a stop at her feet. Then, as she stared in horror, a small black sphere, a seed of strange, pulsing magic, slid from the broken ceiling and merged into Dudley's chest with a soft, almost hungry sigh. Moments later, far across the grounds of Hogwarts, the enchanted admission ledger sprang open on its own. It flipped to the class of 1991, exactly where Dudley Dursley's name belonged. Unbidden ink pooled at the bottom of the page, and in perfectly neat letters, the ledger inscribed, Dudley Dursley. And thus, in one explosive evening, the Dursley boys' fate was rewritten. Chapter X. A crackling ribbon of magic danced along Privet Drive as wizards emerged from the shadows. One by one, they raised their wands and, with precise flicks, cast a memory charm on the gathering muggles. In an instant, anyone who had witnessed the Dursleys' astonishing flight or caught sight of Pierre and his companions forgot every detail. From the circle of spellcasters, a tall, dark-skinned wizard stepped forward and approached the trembling figure of Mrs. Dursley. His expression was calm, compassionate. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, bowing slightly, "I'm Kingsley Shacklebolt. You must be Petunia. I'm here to tell you that your son, Dudley, is a wizard." He turned and called back to the others, "Lower your wands. It's simply the awakening of a young wizard's magic, nothing more." Mrs. Dursley's face flushed with a mixture of relief and anxiety. "But Dudley is already 11. How could his magic only surface now?" she whispered. Kingsley offered her a gentle smile. "Magic manifests itself in its own time. His has just begun to emerge." At that very moment, far from Privet Drive, a snowy owl burst through the window of Mrs. Figg's modest sitting room. Beating its silent wings, it set off into the night sky, bound for Hogwarts. The boy seated nearby watched its departure with a secretive grin. In the blink of an eye, he faded from view. Inside the Ravenclaw common room, high in one of Hogwarts' towers, the boy reappeared. He landed softly on his 4-poster bed, moonlight streaming through the arched window and illuminating his thoughtful green eyes. Though he looked like any other returning student, the quiet confidence in his gaze hinted at hidden achievements, secrets he carried with him into the new term. Early evening in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts. The great circular chamber thrums with peculiar clicks and whirs. On a slender-legged table are dozens of curious silver instruments, spinning and hissing little puffs of smoke. Covering the walls, portraits of past headmasters and headmistresses seem to doze peacefully, some resting their heads on armchairs, others leaning against the edges of their frames. Dominating the center of the room is a broad desk with claw-footed legs. Behind it, on a dusty shelf, sits the battered, well-worn sorting hat. Near the door, a tall gilded perch holds a bedraggled bird that looks like a turkey stripped of half its feathers. In the high-backed chair at the desk sits a wizard with a long hooked nose, half-moon spectacles, and a silver-white beard that glitters like moonlight on water. Without warning, a brown owl swoops in through the open window and lands softly upon the silverware. The wizard blinks back a misty tear as the owl's leg twists free a parchment. The note drifts down onto the desk and, as if enchanted, unfolds itself before him. Albus Dumbledore sat behind his broad oak desk in the soft glow of the office's enchanted lamps. His normally bright blue eyes were slightly dimmed today, as though he had just glimpsed some quietly hopeful news. With a decisive rap of his wand on the desktop, a fresh sheet of parchment lifted into the air and fluttered to his waiting hand. Dumbledore uncapped his silver quill and inscribed a few elaborate lines in spidery handwriting. No sooner had he set the pen aside than the battered file bag beside him stirred, shook itself free of dust, and, almost politely, produced a crisp envelope. In neat looping letters, the name Penny Evans gleamed on its front. He slid his letter inside and sealed the envelope with a faint crackle of magic. Before he could wave farewell, the seal bloomed into a swirl of silver-white flame. The fire danced for an instant, always contained, never hot. Then the envelope vanished, carried off through owlless skies. Dumbledore leaned back and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Everything is moving in the right direction," he murmured. "Harry will be safer now." But the smile faded as he twirled his wand between his fingers. Or is it all just illusion? He wondered aloud. The new generation, Smith, Longbottom, Potter, all at the same school, black wizards disappearing from Nocturne Alley, and then Skywalker suddenly appears out of nowhere. He shook his head, partly amused at his own confusion. If Ryan were here to see him now, he'd raise an eyebrow in surprise. On paper, none of these events connected. Yet Albus Dumbledore, esteemed as the greatest white wizard of his age and a master of the sixth philosophy of love, trusted something deeper than logic. He trusted his heart, his intuition, and the faint pulse of hope behind every flicker of magic. His intuition proved more reliable than any logical deduction. After about 10 minutes, Dumbledore allowed a mysterious smile to cross his lips, and then he was gone. It was Wednesday morning. Around 10 o'clock the previous night, each house's prefects had quietly urged their classmates to bed early. Their message was simple. Dumbledore intended to address the entire school at 8 o'clock the next morning in the Great Hall. At 7:40 a.m., still half asleep, the students filed out of their dormitories by house. 4 neat streams, scarlet and gold for Gryffindor, emerald and silver for Slytherin, blue and bronze for Ravenclaw, and yellow and black for Hufflepuff, wound their way toward the Great Hall. This was the largest assembly since term began. Prefects made their rounds, counting heads at each long table. On the raised platform at the front, the sorting hat rested once more on its high stool. All the professors were seated behind it, with the notable exception of Professor Snape. A hush fell over the hall as the clock hands ticked toward 8. With perfect timing, Albus Dumbledore rose from his seat. Silence blanketed the room, and every pair of eyes, keyed onto him. "Good morning," he said. "Before you begin your meal, I have an announcement," Professor McGonagall called out, her voice carrying across the great hall. "That is why you have all gathered here at 8 o'clock this evening." A hush fell over the tables as every first-year wizard leaned forward, eager for news. "For special reasons," McGonagall continued, "a new student will be joining the Hogwarts family today. Once he arrives, we will hold the sorting ceremony." At once, the long tables erupted in excited chatter. Gryffindor's row of red and gold robes buzzed with the Weasley twins sharing theories, while at the Ravenclaw table, Petite Kate and her classmates stretched their necks, whispering furiously for any scrap of information. Just then, the doors to the Great Hall burst open. Professor Snape strode in, his black robes billowing like the wings of a bat. Instantly, every head turned, and even the most rowdy students fell silent out of respect, or perhaps fear. Behind Snape stood an enormous boy in standard Hogwarts robes. His size was so prodigious that even Crabbe and Goyle, the school's own giants, looked small beside him. Harry Potter shot to his feet with a start. "No," he blurted, eyes fixed on the newcomer. The boy, looking as startled as everyone else, stood motionless, clutching his robes. Snape's dark eyes flicked toward Harry, then back to the stranger. Slowly, the big boy took a hesitant step forward. A ripple of whispers ran through the Slytherin table, echoing around the hall. A new classmate, a sorting yet to come, and mysteries waiting to unfold. Who was this boy who could be hoisted aloft by his own prefect, and whose mere presence had even drawn a roar from Harry Potter? Professor Snape noted the portly student's trembling, shot Harry a sidelong glance, then stepped forward to call the next name under the sorting hat. Dudley Dursley. Dudley's legs shook so violently he had to brush cold sweat from his brow before plopping the hat onto his head. Rare, rare evil, delights in toying with the mighty. Azkaban, the hat announced. No, that's not right. It's fear. He dreads sharing Hogwarts with Harry Potter. He refuses Ravenclaw? Very well. Hufflepuff. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the great hall. Instead of the usual private whispering, every bewildering comment rang out for all to hear. The first years exchanged stunned looks. Could one hat really pass such wildly different judgments? Harry felt a chill crawl down his spine. He pressed a hand to his own seat, secretly grateful that his scrawny frame had kept him off the hat's radar. Perhaps Aunt Petunia's stingy meals had protected him after all. But the chapter wasn't finished yet. Turn to the next page to continue. And don't forget Dudley's cronies, Pierre, Danny, Morkan, Gordon, and the rest, are all hulking bullies. How will the hat sort them? Albus Dumbledore let out a low sigh, rose from his seat, and strode quietly toward the sorting hat. He didn't say a word or place it upon his head. Instead, he lifted it gently with both hands and sent a silent message that only the hat could hear. For a moment, the great hall fell into such stillness you could hear a pin drop. Then Dumbledore opened his pale blue eyes, swept his gaze across the assembled students, and spoke. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying easily to the furthest benches, "rumors are terrible things. It seems the sorting hat's first impressions of Mr. Dudley Dursley were mistaken, so badly, in fact, that it felt compelled to broadcast them aloud. I asked the hat to reconsider, and what you heard in its later remarks is the true assessment of Mr. Dursley's character. You now know which words you can trust." He replaced the sorting hat on its cushion. The long row of Hufflepuffs, previously startled, broke into a smattering of polite applause. At Dumbledore's nod, Dudley trotted nervously down the table and took his seat among them. Without a word, the other Hufflepuffs rose and moved aside, leaving him space to sit with a respectful hush. "Now, let us eat." At that, the hall erupted into laughter and the clatter of dishes as the feast resumed, and Dudley, though still a little pale, allowed himself to relax at last. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table in the great hall, staring down at his untouched dinner. Across from him, Ron leaned forward, his freckled face creased with an expression of pure concern, an expression Harry had never seen on his best friend before. "Harry," Ron began quietly, "the Dudley you keep talking about isn't just any school bully. He's like Darth Vader, a real fat tiger, ready to pounce the moment you show weakness." Harry sighed and pushed his roast beef around with his fork. "Just eat your meal, Ron," he muttered gloomily, not realizing that Professor Snape, seated a few tables away, had abandoned his usual scowl for a look of genuine curiosity and concern. Chapter 100. Snape's Questioning. The staff lounge on the first floor was unusually quiet that afternoon. An almost tangible tension crackled in the air as two wizards faced each other across a scarred oak table. On one side sat Albus Dumbledore, his gaunt features drawn into a hard line. Opposite him, Severus Snape leaned back, arms folded, lips pursed in silent defiance. Dumbledore broke the hush first, his voice low but steely. "Severus, you promised me the boy would grow up healthy." Snape's dark eyes didn't waver. "Albus, you know how long Penelope and I have been friends. She never hides her concerns from me, so tell me, why has Harry been raised in such a fragile environment?" Dumbledore's eyes clouded with frustration. "What do you think the sorting hat meant, Severus? That our boy has endured horrors no child should ever face these past 10 years. Snape's lips tightened. "You're not answering the question. Speak plainly. Why?" A flicker of anger crossed Dumbledore's face, and his voice rose. "You must understand, Severus, everything we've done was to protect Harry. If he remains in the wizarding world, as I intend, his very name will become legend. One day soon, I would not be surprised if the Ministry declared a Harry Potter Day. There will be books about him, songs, plays. Every child in our world will know his name. Snape's reply was cold as the grave. So we're to thrust fame upon a child who can barely walk or speak, for deeds he doesn't even remember? Any child in his position would crack under that kind of weight. Dumbledore leaned forward, his expression pained. Better that he bear that burden with us at his side than face it alone, or worse, be left unprotected. Silence fell. The old clock on the mantel ticked loudly as Snape rose to his full height, looming over the headmaster. For a moment, neither wizard moved, their stark disagreement hanging between them like a storm cloud. Then, without another word, Severus Snape turned on his heel and stalked from the room, leaving Dumbledore to stare after him in troubled contemplation. "Let him be raised far from his past until he's old enough to understand it," Dumbledore said quietly. "Then, you can show him why this was the right choice." Snape's dark eyes flashed. "Answer me plainly, Dumbledore. That isn't an excuse. Even if he turns out to be just like his loathsome father, I couldn't care less. What matters is why you don't care about the boy's upbringing. In your view, just being alive is enough." A muscle twitched at the corner of Snape's thin lips, and his fingers flexed as though he might choke the headmaster where he stood. Dumbledore remained calm. "Yes, Severus, my first and only concern was to keep Harry Potter alive." He leaned forward. His mother gave her life to save him. In doing so, she wove a protection into his very blood, unexpected, enduring magic that still guards him today. I entrusted him to his mother's sister, the only surviving member of his bloodline. Dumbledore paused. "I admit she didn't want him. She took him in with complaints and reluctance, yet she did take him in. That was enough. Her acceptance sealed the spell. Lily's sacrifice became the strongest shield I could grant Harry." Albus Dumbledore folded his hands on the desk and fixed Severus Snape with a steady look. As long as Harry can still call home the place where his mother's blood flows, Voldemort cannot touch him there. When Voldemort tried to kill Harry, he unwittingly bound Lily's protection into him, and into Petunia too. That blood bond is Harry's refuge. He need only return to that home once a year. As long as he calls it home, Voldemort cannot harm him on those grounds. Snape's dark eyes narrowed. "Then why not keep the boy with you and teach him yourself?" His voice was flat, but edged with impatience. Dumbledore's expression softened. "When Voldemort fell, it was only hours ago, and his followers remain at large. They are enraged, ruthless outlaws, many as terrifying as their master once was. Severus, you must see how perilous Harry's situation still is." Snape threw back his shoulders. "I am no hero, Albus. I lack any confidence in raising Harry the way you imagine. At that time, I simply could not bring him to Hogwarts. It would have been irresponsible to expose the other students to such danger." Dumbledore leaned forward, voice growing urgent. "I understand your concerns, but I cannot, not now, deny this protection. You promised me." Snape hesitated, then met Dumbledore's gaze. "Very well, but what of Dudley?" Dumbledore waved a hand as though brushing aside a lingering thought. "The traces of magic on Dudley's body, and the memories it left behind, are all we have. They remind us how deep Lily's sacrifice runs, and why Harry's safety must come first." A weighty silence settled. Outside the window, the last glimmers of daylight faded from the grounds of Hogwarts, and both wizard and professor felt the precariousness of the peace they had won, and the greater challenges still to come. Albus Dumbledore sat behind his desk in his office, peering over the rim of his half-moon spectacles at Severus Snape. The mood was unusually grave. "I've received disturbing reports," Dumbledore began softly. "Shortly after Harry left the Dursleys, unknown wizards attacked Dudley, and even some of Petunia's relatives, for reasons we can't yet fathom. The violence was severe enough, I believe, to have jolted Harry's dormant magic back to life." Snape's dark eyes narrowed. "You think the attack on Dudley, possibly even a magical poisoning, resonated through the boy and awakened Harry's latent powers?" Dumbledore nodded. "Magic tied by blood can lie dormant for years, only to erupt when triggered by trauma. If the Sorting Hat's reading of Harry was incomplete, a strong, tall boy like Dudley might have been an easier target for whoever was hunting him." Snape set down his steaming mug of coffee and folded his arms. "You mentioned advanced enchantments, spells capable of breaching Hogwarts-level protections. Few Death Eaters still at large could manage that." Dumbledore's gaze was steady. "Cruel, precise, unusually powerful magic. These are the hallmarks I've noted. Only a handful of Voldemort's followers fit the bill. Snape leaned forward, voice low. Do these clues point to someone in particular? The headmaster hesitated, then offered a thin, rueful smile. You're always quick to suspect me, Severus, but I assure you, I'm looking at every possibility. I simply need you to do the same. Severus allowed a ghost of a smirk to appear. There are many Death Eaters who favor robust young men, but I know of no one whose magic matches what you describe. If this wizard remains at large, I've yet to meet him. Dumbledore inclined his head. Very well, but please, keep a close watch on Dudley. My decision to place Harry with the Dursleys has put everyone in unexpected danger. Snape rose, smoothing his robes. I'll make sure the boy stays safe, Headmaster. And rest assured, I'll uncover the identity of whoever's behind these attacks. As Snape departed, Dumbledore watched the door close behind him, the lamplight casting shadows that stretched across the room, a quiet reminder that dark times were gathering once more. Professor Dumbledore's office was hushed, lit only by the afternoon sun filtering through tall, arched windows. Albus Dumbledore leaned back in his armchair, rubbed his temples, and regarded Severus Snape with weary eyes. You know how much Petunia desires a child who can perform real magic, Dumbledore began softly. Yet at present, her son's abilities are unremarkable. Snape's dark eyes narrowed. You wish me to curb her expectations? Dumbledore gave a faint, understanding nod. Exactly, and while you're at it, I'd like you to keep an eye on Professor Quirinus Quirrell. Snape cocked an eyebrow. Quirrell? The man who spent time in the dark forest of Albania? That's him, Dumbledore confirmed. He impressed the ministry so much that, fresh from graduation, they offered him the Muggle Studies chair. Unconventional as he is, I want you to assess his methods and his loyalty. Snape inclined his head. Consider it done. Later that day, Harry made his way into the Transfiguration classroom alongside the other first years. Professor McGonagall stood by her desk, wand in hand, as she surveyed the disorderly benches. With a crisp huff, she sent 2 centuries-old oak desks snapping back into their proper shapes. Honestly, Mr. Potter, she said, voice sharp, what on earth happened to you today? Silence rippled through the room. No one dared meet her gaze. This, McGonagall continued, glancing around at her pupils, is the first time one of my transfigurations hasn't at least earned polite applause. Every head swiveled toward Harry, whose stomach churned beneath McGonagall's intense green eyes. And let me be perfectly clear, she added in a low, cutting tone. I'm not here to sing Dumbledore's praises. Now, explain yourself. In all my teaching years, Albus Dumbledore has never once told a lie, Professor McGonagall said, her gray eyes sweeping the room, and the Sorting Hat is just as dependable. She turned to Harry. Potter, since you've lived with the Dursleys, tell me, does Dudley match the Hat's description? Harry relaxed. Yes, Professor. Dudley isn't cruel so much as he's insufferably spoiled, an outright bully, really, but there's no real evil in him. Ron groaned and slouched against the wall. Professor McGonagall raised an eyebrow. Very well. Now, listen closely. Transfiguration is the most dangerous subject we teach at Hogwarts. You must never eat anything that's been transfigured, nor inhale any gas produced in class. Understood? Understood, Professor, the students chorused. When the morning's lessons ended, Harry checked his schedule and let out a relieved sigh. This afternoon we have History of Magic, then Defense Against the Dark Arts. No flying and, thankfully, no potions. Ron nudged him. Potions isn't until Friday, Harry. You're still fretting about your cousin, aren't you? Yes, I'll let you know the moment Dudley turns up as a wizard and shows back up in my life, Harry replied, sounding more gloomy than he'd intended. You've got us, mate, Ron said, offering a reassuring grin. And let's not forget, you're the one who defeated Voldemort. You even outwitted Professor Quirrell and sent Peeves packing. Neville gave Harry's shoulder a firm pat, his own bright smile lending further comfort. From the lounge, Hermione snapped her book shut. Okay, boys, it's almost 11:30. Time to head to the Great Hall for dinner. She rose and tucked the novel, Doraemon, under her arm. Having just reread the chapters about Fat Tiger, a notorious school bully, she couldn't help but sympathize with Dudley's fears. After all, every bully, whether Muggle or wizard, seemed to share the same ruthless heart.